When Ethan Brooks's phone lit up at 11:47 p.m. with a message from his boss, "Come to my room. Don't knock." He knew his carefully balanced world was about to shatter. A single father struggling to keep the lights on, he'd spent years being invisible in the corporate machine. But invisibility only protects you until someone powerful decides they need you. And tonight, in a Chicago hotel where ambition and desperation collided behind closed doors, Ethan would discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can possess isn't money or power. It's the truth. Before we dive into this story of courage, consequence, and the price of doing what's right, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. The notification sound cut through the silence of Ethan Brooks's hotel room like a blade through fabric, sharp, sudden, impossible to ignore. He'd been sitting on the edge of the bed, tie loosened, shirt wrinkled from a day that had stretched into night, staring at the spreadsheet on his laptop screen without really seeing it. Numbers blurred together when exhaustion settled deep enough into your bones. When you'd been running on 4 hours of sleep for so long that rest felt like a foreign concept, a luxury reserved for people whose lives weren't held together by dental floss and determination. His phone sat face up on the nightstand, and even before he reached for it, some primal instinct in his gut tightened. Nobody texted at 11:47 p.m. with good news. Not Maya's babysitter. Mrs. Chen always called if there was a problem. Not his landlord. Mr. Kozlov preferred leaving passive-aggressive notes taped to doors. Not his sister in Portland. Rachel had given up checking in months ago, tired of hearing the same story of struggle dressed in different words. Ethan picked up the phone with hands that had fixed servers, rewired network cables, and changed Maya's diapers when she was an infant, capable hands that had learned to be steady, even when everything else was falling apart. The screen glowed in the darkness of the hotel room, and his eyes adjusted to read the message that would change everything. Claire Monroe. Come to my room. Don't knock. 5 words. Simple. Direct. Completely terrifying. Ethan's first instinct was to check the sender again, certain he'd misread. But there it was. Claire Monroe, Chief Operating Officer. The woman whose heels clicked like gunshots down the corporate hallways, whose reputation preceded her like thunder before lightning. In 3 years of working as an IT technician for Meridian Financial Group, he'd spoken to her exactly twice. Once when she'd needed her password reset and had looked through him like he was made of glass. Once when he'd fixed a network issue during a crucial video conference and she'd offered a crisp adequate before turning away. Claire Monroe didn't text low-level IT staff. She barely acknowledged their existence. His second instinct was darker, more immediate. The kind of assumption that came from being a single father in a world that specialized in exploitation, from knowing that desperation had a smell and predators could sense it from miles away. He'd heard the stories, powerful executives, late nights, hotel rooms away from home. Propositions dressed up as opportunities. Advancement offered in exchange for dignity, surrendered. Ethan had spent 7 years protecting Maya from a world that would chew her up and spit her out if he let it. 7 years since her mother, Jessica, had walked out of their apartment and into a life that didn't include diapers and responsibility and the grinding monotony of parenthood. 7 years of learning that the only person he could trust completely was a little girl who still believed in magic and thought her father could fix anything. He looked around the hotel room. Generic, sterile, identical to 1,000 others scattered across America. The annual corporate retreat in Chicago was supposed to be about team building and strategic planning. 2 days of presentations, networking dinners, and forced camaraderie with colleagues he barely knew. For Ethan, it was 2 days away from Maya, 2 days of Mrs. Chen sleeping in their spare room, 2 days of anxiety that hummed beneath his skin like electricity through bad wiring. His phone buzzed again. Claire Monroe. Now, Ethan, she knew his name. That detail shouldn't have mattered, but it did. In 3 years, she'd never used it. He was IT or tech support, or occasionally you there. The use of his actual name felt both intimate and ominous, like a doctor using your first name before delivering bad news. Ethan stood, his 34-year-old body protesting the long day. He wasn't old, but he felt it sometimes, in his lower back from hours hunched over servers, in his eyes from screens that glowed too bright, in his chest where worry had taken up permanent residence. He caught his reflection in the mirror above the dresser and barely recognized himself. When had the circles under his eyes become permanent? When had his hair started thinning at the temples? When had he become this worn-down version of the man he'd once imagined he'd be? He grabbed his keycard, slipped it into his pocket, and moved toward the door, then stopped. What if his first instinct was right? What if this was exactly what it looked like? A proposition, a test, a line he'd have to choose whether to cross. He had Maya to think about. Maya, who was sleeping in their small apartment 300 miles away, who'd hugged him so tight before he left that he could still feel the impression of her small arms around his neck. Maya, who trusted him to make the right choices, to be the kind of man worth looking up to. But he also had rent to think about, the electricity bill that had arrived with a past due notice, the medical bills from Maya's ear infection last month, the slow, steady erosion of his savings account, watching it drain like blood from a wound he couldn't quite stop. What did he have, really? Dignity wasn't keeping the lights on. Principles didn't fill Maya's belly or pay for her school supplies. He'd been playing by the rules his whole life, working hard, keeping his head down, doing the right thing. And where had it gotten him? Stuck in the same position he'd started in, watching younger guys with better connections climb past him, living paycheck to paycheck in a world that rewarded ruthlessness and punished honesty. Ethan opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The Whitmore Hotel was expensive in that understated way that whispered wealth rather than shouted it. Thick carpet that absorbed sound. Lighting designed to flatter and obscure. Artwork on the walls that was probably original, but looked generic enough to offend no one. The kind of place where people made decisions that shaped markets and destroyed lives, all while sipping $20 cocktails and pretending civility was the same as morality. Claire's room was on the same floor, 3 doors down. Close enough that the message had been an order, not a request. Close enough that she'd known he'd see it immediately, that proximity eliminated any excuse for delay. Ethan walked slowly, each step a choice he was still making. He could turn around. He could pretend he'd fallen asleep, hadn't seen the message until morning when plausible deniability could shelter him from consequence. He could protect himself the way he'd learned to, by being invisible, unremarkable, the kind of person who never got noticed enough to be used. But invisibility had its own cost. He disappeared so thoroughly into survival that sometimes he wondered if there was anything left of the Ethan who'd once had dreams bigger than making it to the end of the month. The Ethan who'd believed in something beyond endurance. He reached her door. Room 847. The numbers gleamed in the hallway light, brass catching and reflecting like a warning. "Don't knock," she'd said, which meant she was expecting him to just walk in, which meant this was definitely what he thought it was. Ethan raised his hand to knock anyway, some last rebellion against the humiliation of it, then stopped. If he knocked, he was disobeying a direct instruction from the COO. If he walked in without knocking, he was complying with something that made his skin crawl. Either way, he lost. He tried the handle. Unlocked. Of course it was unlocked. She'd planned this, orchestrated it, removed every barrier between the hallway and whatever waited inside. The door swung open on silent hinges. The room was dark. Not completely. Ambient light from the city filtered through sheer curtains, painting everything in shades of gray and shadow. Enough to see that this wasn't a standard room. This was a suite. Living area, separate bedroom visible through a partially open door, furniture that suggested comfort and luxury. The kind of space reserved for executives who needed to feel important even when they slept. "Close the door." Claire's voice came from the darkness near the window. Calm, controlled, nothing seductive about it, nothing inviting, just an order delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never been disobeyed. Ethan stepped inside and let the door click shut behind him. His heart was hammering against his ribs, adrenaline flooding his system with the clear message that he was in danger. Not physical danger, he didn't think, but danger nonetheless. The kind that could swallow his life whole and leave nothing behind. "Ms. Monroe, sit down." She gestured to the couch. Not an invitation, a command. He sat. The leather was cool through his dress pants, expensive enough that it didn't creak under his weight. From this angle, he could see her more clearly. She stood by the window in a white blouse and dark slacks, arms crossed, posture rigid. Her blonde hair was pulled back in the same severe style she wore in the office. No wine glass in her hand. No mood lighting. No music playing softly in the background. Nothing about this fit the scenario he'd braced himself for. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked. "No, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am. It makes me sound old." A pause. "Call me Claire." "I don't think that's—" "It doesn't matter what you think is appropriate, Ethan. Nothing about tonight is appropriate." She turned from the window to face him fully, and in the dim light, he could see something he'd never noticed before. Claire Monroe was exhausted, not tired from a long day, exhausted in the bone-deep way that came from carrying weight that never lightened, from fighting battles that never ended. "I'm going to tell you something, and then you're going to make a choice. And whatever you choose, I need you to understand that I won't hold it against you." "Miss Monroe, Claire, I don't understand what's happening. 6 months ago, I noticed discrepancies in our quarterly reports." She moved away from the window, pacing now, her movements controlled but restless. Small things at first. Numbers that didn't quite align, expenditures that seemed inflated. Nothing obvious enough to raise red flags, but enough to make me look closer. Ethan's confusion must have shown on his face because she stopped pacing and looked at him directly. "I'm not propositioning you, Ethan. I'm confiding in you. There's a difference." Relief flooded through him so fast it left him dizzy. Not that. Whatever this was, it wasn't that. "Okay. The discrepancies weren't mistakes. They were systematic, deliberate. Someone was embezzling from Meridian and they were good at it. Good enough that it had been going on for almost 2 years before I caught the pattern. By the time I'd traced the digital trail, we were looking at nearly $1 million. $1 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, meaningless. Ethan made $42,000 a year. $1 million was another universe, another dimension of wealth and consequence. "I documented everything," Claire continued, "built a case, gathered evidence. And then I made the mistake of storing it all in one place, an encrypted folder on the company server. I thought I was being smart, keeping it secure while I figured out how to present it to the board without becoming the target myself. What happened? Someone accessed my folder, someone with high-level clearance and enough technical sophistication to cover their tracks." She looked at him now with an expression he couldn't quite read. 3 days ago, my evidence disappeared. Not deleted, disappeared. Like it had never existed. And the person who took it knew exactly what they were doing because they left behind just enough trace data to suggest I'd fabricated the whole thing. Ethan's mind was racing now, pulling together pieces of information he didn't know he had. "You need me to recover it." "No." Claire shook her head. "I need you to confirm it existed in the first place." "I don't understand." "Last Tuesday, you performed routine maintenance on the executive server cluster. You ran system diagnostics, checked file integrity, generated usage reports. Do you remember?" He did. It was mundane work, the kind of thing he did twice a month without thinking about it. "Yes." "Those usage reports show file access patterns. They show that my encrypted folder existed and that it contained the exact number of files I claimed it did. They show access timestamps that prove I'd been working on this investigation for months. They're not enough to recover the evidence itself, but they're enough to prove I'm not lying about having had it." Okay. Ethan was starting to understand now, starting to see the shape of what she was asking. "You want me to testify to that, to confirm what the reports show?" "I want you to do more than that." Claire sat down in the chair across from him, leaning forward, her intensity palpable even in the dim light. "Tomorrow morning, there's an emergency board meeting. The CFO is going to accuse me of fabricating fraud allegations to cover my own mismanagement of company resources. He's going to paint me as unstable, vindictive, incompetent, and he's going to recommend my termination." The CFO. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Richard Halloway. "Richard Halloway," Claire confirmed, "who has been with Meridian for 15 years, who the board trusts implicitly, who is, incidentally, the person embezzling nearly $1 million from our accounts." The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. A powerful executive, untouchable and entrenched, A woman who'd discovered his crimes and now faced professional destruction for it. And Ethan, a nobody IT technician whose testimony might be the only thing standing between justice and catastrophe. "You want me to speak at the board meeting," he said quietly, "to confirm that the evidence existed, to back up your accusations against one of the most powerful men in the company." "Yes." "He'll destroy me." "Probably." The honesty of it stole his breath. No false promises, no assurances that everything would be fine. Just the brutal truth delivered without decoration. "I have a daughter," Ethan said. "I have bills. I have a life that barely works on a good day. If I do this, if I stand up in front of the board and accuse Richard Halloway of embezzlement, I'll be lucky if I only get fired. He could blacklist me from every tech job in the industry. He could make it impossible for me to find work. He could destroy my entire future." "He could," Claire agreed. "And I would understand completely if you chose to protect yourself and your daughter. I would do the same thing in your position." "Then why are you asking me to do this?" She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with an expression that was equal parts desperation and respect. "Because I've run out of options. Because I'm about to lose everything I've worked for my entire career. Because a man who has stolen nearly $1 million is going to walk away clean while I'm branded as the unstable woman who couldn't handle the pressure. And because," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "because in 3 years of working at Meridian, you're the only person I've observed who seems to give a damn about doing things right rather than doing things easy. You don't know me. I know you stay late to finish work properly instead of rushing through it to meet quotas. I know you've turned down opportunities to cut corners that would have made your job easier. I know that when you reset my password that first time, you took the extra step to secure my account with two-factor authentication, even though I didn't ask for it and most people wouldn't bother. I know that you're the kind of person who does the right thing even when no one's watching, even when there's no reward for it." Ethan laughed, bitter and tired. "And where has that gotten me? Still in the same position I started in, still struggling to pay rent, still invisible." "You're not invisible to me." Claire's voice was soft but firm. "Not anymore." They sat in silence, the weight of the choice pressing down on Ethan like physical force. Outside, Chicago hummed with life, cars moving through streets, people living their lives, the world continuing to turn regardless of the small human dramas playing out in hotel rooms and boardrooms and quiet apartments where single fathers tucked their daughters into bed and wondered if they were doing enough. "What happens if I say no?" Ethan asked. "I go into that meeting alone. I make my accusations without corroboration. The board dismisses me as delusional or vindictive. Halloway remains CFO. The embezzlement continues. I lose my career, and you go home to your daughter with your job intact and your future secure. And if I say yes? You testify to what the server logs show. You confirm that my evidence existed. You give the board enough doubt about Halloway's innocence that they might order an independent audit before making any decisions. You become a target for a powerful man who doesn't forgive threats to his position. And you go home to your daughter with no guarantees about anything except that you told the truth when it mattered." Ethan thought about Maya, 7 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, obsessed with dinosaurs, and convinced that her father was the strongest, smartest, bravest person in the world. What would he tell her? How would he explain that he'd lost his job, that they might lose their apartment, that the stability he'd fought so hard to give her had evaporated because he'd chosen to help a woman he barely knew stand up to a man he couldn't defeat? But then he thought about what he'd be teaching her if he walked away. That power always wins. That doing the right thing doesn't matter if it costs too much. That survival is more important than integrity. That her father was the kind of man who could look at injustice and choose comfort over courage. "I need to think about it," he said finally. Claire nodded. "You have until 8 a.m. The meeting starts at 9. If you're not there, I'll understand. If you are..." She stood, moving toward the door, preparing to let him leave. "If you are, I want you to know that regardless of what happens, I'll remember that you showed up when it mattered." Ethan stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. This wasn't supposed to be his fight. He was nobody, nothing, just a technician who kept the servers running and tried to keep his daughter fed. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't brave, He was just tired and scared and desperate for his life to be easier, not harder. But as he moved toward the door, Claire spoke again. "Ethan." He turned. "Your daughter's name is Maya, right?" He froze. "How do you... You have her picture as your phone wallpaper. I saw it when you fixed my computer last month. She's beautiful. She looks like you." "Thank you. What kind of man do you want her to remember you as?" The question hit him like a fist to the chest. Not what kind of man are you, not what kind of man should you be, but what kind of man do you want to be remembered as? The past tense of it, the finality, the recognition that our children's memories of us are the only immortality most of us get. Ethan left the room without answering because there was no good answer to give. He walked back to his own room in a daze, his mind cycling through scenarios and outcomes and possibilities, all of them terrifying, none of them good. He sat on his bed and pulled out his phone, looking at the wallpaper Claire had mentioned. Maya grinning at the camera, gap-toothed and joyful, holding up a clay dinosaur she'd made in art class like it was the greatest treasure in the world. He opened his recent calls and stared at Mrs. Chen's number. It was late, but she told him to call any time if he needed to talk to Maya. Just hearing his daughter's voice would help, would give him clarity, would remind him what he was fighting for. His finger hovered over the call button. Then he set the phone down. If he called Maya now, if he heard her voice asking when he'd be home, telling him about her day, expressing the absolute faith she had in him, he knew what he'd do. He'd choose her. He'd choose safety. He'd walk into that board meeting tomorrow as a spectator, watch Claire Monroe's career burn, and go home to his daughter with his cowardice intact and his conscience screaming. But if he didn't call, if he sat here alone in this anonymous hotel room and made this choice in the cold space where principle lived separate from love, Ethan lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried to remember who he'd been before survival had become his only goal, before Jessica had left, before parenthood had taught him that fear could be a full-time job, before he'd learned to be invisible. He'd been a kid who believed in fairness, who'd gotten into fistfights defending smaller kids from bullies, even though he'd always lost, who turned in the wallet he'd found with $200 in it because keeping it felt like theft, even if no one would have known. Who'd sat with his mother during her cancer treatments and held her hand and promised her he'd be the kind of man who made her proud. That kid felt like a stranger now, a naive fool who hadn't yet learned that the world rewarded the opposite of everything he'd believed in. But maybe, Ethan thought, maybe that kid had been right about something. Maybe honor wasn't about winning. Maybe it was about choosing who you were going to be when the cost of integrity exceeded its value. Maybe courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Maybe the question wasn't whether he could afford to help Claire Monroe. Maybe the question was whether he could afford not to. Ethan closed his eyes and thought about his daughter, about the man he wanted her to remember, about the lessons he was teaching her every single day through the choices he made when he thought she wasn't watching. And somewhere in the darkness behind his eyelids, in the quiet space where truth lived, he already knew what his answer would be. He just wasn't sure yet if he had the courage to give it. The alarm on Ethan's phone went off at 6:30, pulling him from sleep that had never really arrived. He'd spent the night in that horrible liminal space between consciousness and rest, his mind churning through possibilities like a machine processing data it couldn't quite parse. Every time he'd started to drift off, his thoughts would snag on some new consequence, some fresh disaster that testifying might bring down on his head, and adrenaline would spike through his system like electricity through bad wiring. He sat up, his body aching from tension he'd carried all night. The hotel room looked different in the morning light, less ominous, more mundane. Just another corporate space designed for people passing through, leaving no mark, making no impression. Through the window, Chicago stretched out in shades of gray and gold, the city waking up to another day of commerce and ambition and all the small moral compromises that kept the machinery running. Ethan checked his phone. A text from Mrs. Chen had arrived at midnight. Maya had gone to bed without fuss, asked about him 3 times, wanted to know if he was coming home with a present. The ordinariness of it made his chest ache. His daughter's world was so small, so safe, built entirely on the foundation of his ability to provide and protect. What right did he have to risk that for a principal? For a woman he barely knew fighting a battle that wasn't his? But then he scrolled further and found the photo Mrs. Chen had attached. Maya asleep in her bed, clutching the stuffed triceratops he'd bought her for her birthday, her face peaceful in a way that trusted the world would still be there when she woke up. Trusted that her father would make sure of it. He showered in water that ran too hot, dressed in the same suit he'd worn yesterday because he hadn't packed for drama, only for presentations and networking dinners that no longer mattered. His hands shook slightly as he knotted his tie. Not from fear, exactly. From the weight of a decision he'd made sometime in the dark hours before dawn. In that space where sleep should have been, but wasn't. He was going to testify. The realization sat in his stomach like lead, heavy and undeniable. He didn't feel brave. He felt terrified and stupid and certain that this would end in disaster. But some part of him, maybe the part that was still that kid who'd believed in fairness, or maybe just the part that couldn't look at Maya's sleeping face and choose to be a coward, had decided that Claire Monroe was telling the truth and Richard Holloway was a thief, and that mattered more than job security. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Unknown. Conference room A, 3rd floor, 8:45 a.m. Come early. We need to prepare. Claire. Had to be. She'd gotten his number from HR files or IT records or however executives acquired information about people beneath their notice. The message was clinical, professional, nothing in it to suggest the desperation she'd shown last night. Back to being the COO. Back to being untouchable. Except she wasn't untouchable. That was the whole point. She was about to be destroyed by a man who'd stolen nearly $1 million, and the only thing standing between her and professional annihilation was Ethan's willingness to confirm what a server log showed. He left his room at 8:15, taking the elevator down to the 3rd floor where Meridian had rented conference space for the retreat. The hallways were quiet, most of the staff still at breakfast or in their rooms preparing for the day's scheduled events. Events that would now be overshadowed by whatever explosion was about to detonate in conference room A. The door was closed when he arrived. He raised his hand to knock, then remembered Claire's instruction from last night. Don't knock. Just another small test, another moment of choosing compliance over autonomy. He tried the handle. Unlocked. Claire stood at the head of the conference table looking at her laptop screen with the focused intensity of someone preparing for war. She'd changed clothes, a different suit, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, severe and professional. Her hair was pulled back tight enough that it looked painful. No makeup beyond what was necessary to look polished. Everything about her presentation said, "I am not a woman to be dismissed." She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite relief, not quite gratitude, just a flicker of acknowledgement that he'd shown up when he could have stayed away. "Close the door," she said. He did. The room felt immediately smaller, more contained. Conference room A was designed for maybe 20 people. A long table, ergonomic chairs, a screen for presentations, windows that looked out over the Chicago skyline. In 2 hours, this room would be full of board members and executives making decisions that would reshape lives. Right now, it was just the two of them and the truth they were about to try to defend. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Claire said, closing her laptop. "I wasn't sure either." "What changed your mind?" Ethan thought about Maya's sleeping face, about the kind of man he wanted to be remembered as, about all the small choices that accumulated into a life. "I couldn't figure out how to explain to my daughter why I didn't." Claire nodded slowly, understanding passing between them that had nothing to do with words. "I need to prepare you for what's about to happen. Richard Holloway is not going to go down easy. He's going to attack your credibility, your competence, your motivations. He's going to try to paint you as either incompetent or complicit. He'll suggest you're lying to protect me because I'm offering you something, a promotion, money, whatever narrative makes you look compromised. I'm not lying. I know that. But perception matters more than truth in rooms like this. The board members don't know you. You're just an IT technician to them. Part of the invisible infrastructure that keeps things running. Richard is a colleague, a friend to some of them, a trusted advisor who's been with the company for 15 years, Who do you think they're predisposed to believe? The question hung in the air, rhetorical and damning. Ethan knew the answer. Everyone knew the answer. Power protected power. The system defended itself against threats, and truth was only threatening when it came from someone who mattered. "So why am I here?" he asked. "If they're going to believe him anyway, what's the point of me testifying?" "Because doubt is a weapon," Claire said. "I can't prove Richard embezzled the money, not without the evidence he destroyed. But if I can create enough doubt about his innocence, if I can make the board uncomfortable enough with the possibility that he's lying, they might order an independent audit before making any decisions. And an audit will find what I found. The discrepancies are still there. The pattern is still there. It's just hidden under enough layers that no one's been looking. An audit takes time, resources. The board would have to approve it, which is exactly what Richard is counting on them not doing. It's expensive. It's disruptive. It suggests the company has problems serious enough to warrant external investigation. Much easier to dismiss me as the problem and move on." She walked to the window, looking out at the city. "But if you confirm that my evidence existed, that I'd been working on this investigation for months, that the usage reports show exactly what I claimed they showed, then it's not just my word against his. It's data, documentation, the kind of thing boards can't ignore quite so easily." Ethan moved to stand beside her at the window. From this height, Chicago looked manageable, comprehensible. You could see the patterns of it, the grid of streets, the flow of traffic. From up here, it all made sense. But he knew that down at street level, where actual people lived actual lives, nothing was that clear. Everything was complicated by need and fear and the 1,000 small compromises required just to survive. "Tell me about the server logs," Claire said. "Walk me through exactly what they show. I need to know what you're going to say before you say it." Ethan nodded, grateful for the shift to technical details. This he knew. This he could explain without fear or doubt. "Last Tuesday, I performed routine maintenance on the executive server cluster. Part of that process involves generating usage reports, basically a detailed record of who accessed what files, when they accessed them, how long the files were open, whether they were modified. It's standard IT practice. We keep the reports for 90 days for security purposes. And my folder appeared in those reports." "Your encrypted folder appeared in those reports," Ethan confirmed. "Labeled Financial Review, Confidential. The report shows it contained 47 files, mostly spreadsheets and PDFs. It shows you'd been accessing it regularly for approximately 6 months, usually late at night or early in the morning. The access patterns were consistent with someone doing detailed analytical work, long sessions, multiple files open simultaneously, frequent cross-referencing. Could someone fake those reports? Not easily. They're generated automatically by the system and stored in multiple redundant locations. You'd have to have root-level access to the entire server infrastructure and know exactly which databases to manipulate. It's theoretically possible, but it would leave traces, digital fingerprints that would show up in a forensic analysis." Claire turned to face him fully. "Richard has the technical resources to fake them if he wanted to. He could hire consultants, specialists." "He could," Ethan agreed. "But he didn't know these reports existed until recently. Nobody pays attention to routine IT documentation. It's boring infrastructure stuff, the kind of thing that only matters when something goes wrong. He destroyed your evidence, but he didn't know there were usage reports that proved the evidence had existed in the first place. So the reports are his blind spot." "They were his blind spot," Ethan corrected. "Now that we're bringing them up, he'll try to discredit them, suggest they're unreliable, or that I'm misinterpreting the data. But the reports themselves are clean. They show what they show." Claire was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "You understand what you're walking into. Once you testify, once you confirm those reports exist and what they contain, Richard will come after you. Not today necessarily, but eventually. Men like him don't forget people who threaten their position." "I know." "You could still walk away. I could tell the board I have a witness who will testify to the usage reports, but that he's afraid of retaliation. It would be almost as effective, and you'd maintain some distance from this." Ethan looked at her directly. This woman who'd built a career on being untouchable and was now vulnerable in ways that clearly terrified her. If you're brave enough to stand in front of the board and accuse the CFO of embezzlement, I'm brave enough to back you up. Even if neither of us feels particularly brave. Something flickered across Claire's face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition, or just the acknowledgement that they were in this together now, for better or worse. Before she could respond, the door to the conference room opened. Ethan turned, expecting someone from the board or maybe another executive arriving early. Instead, a man in his late 50s entered, expensive suit, perfectly tailored, silver hair styled with the casual precision that spoke of expensive barbers and unlimited time. His face was handsome in that weathered way some men achieved, like he'd aged into distinction rather than decline. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, never been denied, never had to worry about whether he belonged in a room. Richard Halloway, the CFO, the thief, the untouchable. "Claire," he said, his voice warm and concerned in a way that made Ethan's skin crawl. "I heard you'd called an emergency board meeting. I wanted to speak with you before things got started. Clear the air, maybe find a way to resolve this without making it messier than it needs to be." Claire's expression didn't change, but Ethan could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from pavement in summer. "Richard, I wasn't expecting you until 9. I thought it would be better to talk privately, board member to board member, before we involve the others." His eyes slid to Ethan, dismissive and evaluating in the same glance. "Though I see you've already involved staff in what should be an executive matter. Ethan is here because his testimony is relevant to the accusations I'm making." "Accusations," Richard repeated, the word heavy with disappointment. "Claire, we've worked together for how long? 5 years? 6? I thought we had mutual respect. I thought we understood each other. And now you're throwing around accusations of embezzlement based on evidence you claim exists but can't produce?" He moved further into the room, positioning himself between Claire and the door in a way that looked casual but wasn't. "It's concerning. It makes me worry about your state of mind." "My state of mind is fine, Richard. What's concerning is that nearly $1 million has been systematically stolen from Meridian over the past 2 years, and you're more worried about my accusations than the actual theft." Richard's expression shifted, the warmth draining away to reveal something colder underneath. "You're making serious allegations without proof. You're disrupting company operations during a crucial quarter. You're damaging reputations. Mine, yes, but also your own. Over what? Server logs? Data that could be interpreted a dozen different ways?" "The data shows exactly what I said it shows," Ethan said quietly. He hadn't meant to speak, but something about Richard's casual dismissal, his certainty that he could talk his way out of this, triggered a response Ethan didn't know he had in him. Richard turned to him fully now, really looking at him for the first time. "And you are?" "Ethan Brooks, IT support." "IT support." Richard smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. "And you're qualified to interpret financial data? To understand the complexities of corporate accounting? To make judgments about CFO-level operations?" "I'm qualified to read server logs, to confirm what files existed and when they were accessed. That's all I'm testifying to." "At Claire's request, I assume. Tell me, Ethan, what has she offered you in exchange for your cooperation? A promotion? A raise? Maybe just the thrill of being involved in executive-level drama?" "She hasn't offered me anything except the opportunity to tell the truth." Richard laughed, sharp and condescending. "The truth? How noble, how refreshingly naive. You have a daughter, don't you? Maya, I believe, 7 years old? That's a beautiful age. Still young enough to believe her father can protect her from everything." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Ethan felt ice slide down his spine. "Leave my daughter out of this." "I'm not threatening your daughter, Ethan. I'm simply pointing out that you have responsibilities. A life that depends on your income, your career, your reputation. Are you really willing to risk all of that to back up accusations from a woman who's clearly experiencing some kind of professional crisis? The only crisis here is that you stole nearly $1 million, and now you're trying to destroy the person who caught you." The words came out before Ethan could stop them, direct and unfiltered. Richard's expression hardened, the pretense of warmth evaporating completely. "Careful," Richard said softly. "You're way out of your depth here. You're a technician, replaceable, Forgettable. The kind of person who could disappear from this company tomorrow and no one would even notice. Don't make yourself memorable for the wrong reasons. That's enough. Claire stepped between them, her voice carrying an authority Ethan had only heard from her in passing. Richard, you can try to intimidate my witness all you want, but it won't change what the data shows. It won't change that you destroyed evidence of your own embezzlement. And it won't stop me from presenting everything I have to the board in, she checked her watch, 45 minutes. You're making a mistake, Claire. A career-ending mistake. The board trusts me. They've known me for 15 years. You've been COO for what, 3 years? You're still proving yourself, still trying to earn the respect I already have. And when this is over, when your accusations fall apart because you have no evidence, and your witness is just some low-level IT guy who doesn't understand what he's looking at, where do you think that leaves you? It leaves me knowing I did the right thing, even if it cost me everything. Richard studied her for a long moment, something like genuine puzzlement crossing his face. You actually believe that matters. You actually think integrity counts for something in this world. He shook his head slowly. That's almost sad. I'd feel sorry for you if you weren't trying to destroy me. I'm not trying to destroy you, Richard. I'm trying to stop you from destroying this company. Same thing, from where I'm standing. Richard moved toward the door, then paused. Last chance, both of you. Walk away from this. Claire, tell the board you made a mistake, you misinterpreted some data, you're withdrawing your accusations. Ethan, go back to fixing computers and forget this conversation ever happened. Do that, and we all move on with our careers intact. Refuse, and I promise you'll regret it. We're not walking away, Claire said. Richard looked at Ethan. You're sure about this? Sure enough to risk your daughter's future? Ethan thought about Maya, about the wallet he'd turned in as a kid, about his mother holding his hand during chemotherapy and making him promise to be a good man. Thought about all the moments in life where you chose what kind of person you were going to be when it would have been easier to be someone else. I'm sure, he said. Richard's smile was cold. Then you're a fool, both of you. He left, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that felt like a death sentence. Claire sank into one of the conference chairs, the adrenaline that had kept her upright draining away in Richard's absence. That was a preview of what's coming. He's going to be worse in front of the board, more polished, more convincing. He threatened my daughter. He did, and he'll deny it if you bring it up, make it sound like you're being paranoid or overly sensitive. That's how men like Richard operate. They make their threats subtle enough to maintain deniability. Ethan sat down across from her, his hands shaking now that the confrontation was over. I'm scared. Good. You should be. I'm terrified. Claire looked at him with raw honesty. But we're doing this anyway, because the alternative is letting him win. Letting him walk away with $1 million while I take the fall for catching him. Teaching everyone else in this company that crime pays as long as you have enough power to cover it up. What happens after the meeting, assuming they even listen to us? If we're lucky, they order an audit. If we're very lucky, the audit finds what I found and Richard faces consequences. If we're unlucky, they fire me today and start building a case to fire you quietly next week. If we're very unlucky, Richard makes good on his threats and makes both our lives hell in ways that don't technically violate employment law. Not great odds. No, Claire agreed. Not great at all. They sat in silence for a while, watching the clock tick toward 9, toward the moment when they'd have to walk into that conference room and bet everything on the hope that truth mattered more than power. Ethan knew it was a bad bet. Knew that people like Richard Holloway usually won because the system was designed to protect them. Knew that he was probably throwing away his career and maybe his ability to support his daughter for a principle that most people had abandoned by the time they learned to tie their shoes. But he also knew that if he walked away now, if he let fear win, he'd be teaching Maya a lesson he never wanted her to learn, that courage was negotiable, that doing the right thing was optional, that her father was just another person who talked about principles but abandoned them when they became inconvenient. At 8:55, board members started arriving. They filtered in with coffee cups and tablets, suits expensive enough that Ethan could probably pay 3 months' rent with what they'd spent on clothing. They looked at him curiously. Who was this technician sitting at the executive conference table, but didn't ask questions? Claire had positioned him deliberately, Ethan realized, putting him in a place of subtle authority rather than hiding him in a corner like staff. By 9 o'clock, the room was full. 8 board members, 3 additional executives, Richard Halloway sitting at the opposite end of the table from Claire with an expression of patient concern. The chairman, an older man named Douglas Pierce, with steel gray hair and shrewd eyes, called the meeting to order. "Claire, you've called this emergency session. The floor is yours." Claire stood, and Ethan could see the transformation happen in real time. The vulnerable woman from last night disappeared, replaced by the COO who'd built a reputation for being untouchable. Her voice was clear, her presentation methodical. She laid out the timeline of her investigation, the patterns she'd noticed, the evidence she'd compiled. When she got to the part about the evidence being destroyed, she didn't hesitate. 3 days ago, the encrypted folder containing my complete investigation was deleted from the company server. Not just deleted, scrubbed in a way that suggests someone with high-level technical access and sophisticated knowledge of our systems. The timing is not coincidental. I had informed the CFO that I'd uncovered financial irregularities and would be bringing them to the board's attention this week. Richard raised his hand, his expression more disappointed than defensive. "Douglas, if I may?" "Go ahead, Richard." "I'm deeply concerned about what we're hearing, not because Claire is accusing me, though that is, of course, troubling, but because what she's describing sounds like a combination of misunderstood data and, frankly, paranoia. Claire is a talented executive, but she's been under enormous pressure lately. The merger negotiations, the restructuring, the quarterly targets. It's a lot for anyone to handle. I'm wondering if perhaps the stress has led to some unfortunate conclusions." "I'm not stressed, and I'm not paranoid," Claire said sharply. "I'm reporting a crime. Based on evidence that no longer exists. Evidence that conveniently no one else ever saw. Evidence that you claim was deleted by me, despite the fact that I have neither the technical capability nor the motivation to do such a thing." Richard's voice was reasonable, patient, like he was explaining something to a child. "Claire, I understand that you believe what you're saying, but belief isn't proof." "The usage reports are proof," Claire said. She gestured to Ethan. This was it. The moment where he either backed her up or saved himself. Every eye in the room turned to him, and he felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure. Douglas looked at him curiously. "And you are?" Ethan stood, his legs steadier than he'd expected. "Ethan Brooks, IT support. Last Tuesday, I performed routine maintenance on the executive server cluster and generated usage reports. Those reports show that Ms. Monroe's encrypted folder existed and contained 47 files. The access patterns confirm she'd been working on it for approximately 6 months. The reports are time-stamped, automatically generated, and stored in multiple redundant locations. Reports that could be misinterpreted by someone without proper context," Richard interjected smoothly. "Ethan is a competent technician, I'm sure, but interpreting usage reports requires understanding what the data actually means. A folder labeled Financial Review doesn't prove embezzlement. Access patterns don't prove criminal activity. All it proves is that Claire had files on the server, which no one is disputing." "The reports prove the evidence existed," Ethan said quietly. "Miss Monroe isn't making this up. The investigation happened. The evidence was real. Someone destroyed it. Or she deleted it herself when she realized her accusations were baseless," Richard suggested, "creating a convenient narrative where she's the victim of a cover-up rather than the source of false allegations." The room erupted into discussion, board members asking questions, Richard providing smooth answers, Claire trying to maintain control of a narrative that was slipping away. Ethan stood there feeling useless, watching the political machinery grind up truth and spit out whatever version of reality would cause the least disruption. Then Douglas raised his hand, silencing the room. "This is clearly a serious matter that requires investigation. Richard, I'm afraid we'll need to suspend you pending an independent audit of the financial records Claire has flagged. It's not an accusation. It's due diligence." Richard's mask slipped just for a second. "Douglas, that's completely unnecessary. It will damage company morale, disrupt operations, and waste resources investigating nothing. Nevertheless, it's what we're going to do. Claire has made specific allegations backed by at least circumstantial evidence. We'd be negligent not to follow through." Douglas looked at Claire. How long would you estimate an audit would take? 2 weeks for a preliminary review, maybe a month for a comprehensive analysis. Then we'll reconvene in 2 weeks. Richard, you're suspended with pay during the investigation. Claire, you'll work with the auditors and provide whatever information they need. Ethan, he looked at Ethan with something that might have been respect. Make sure those usage reports are properly preserved and available for review. The meeting adjourned. Board members filed out, some looking concerned, others annoyed at the disruption. Richard left without looking at either Claire or Ethan, his expression carefully neutral. But Ethan could see the rage in the set of his shoulders, the tightness of his jaw. Claire sagged against the table once they were alone. We did it. We actually did it. They ordered an audit, Ethan said, not quite believing it. They actually listened. Douglas is a good man. Old school corporate, but he takes fiduciary responsibility seriously. If the audit finds what I think it will find, Richard is finished. And if it doesn't? Claire met his eyes. Then we're both finished, but at least we'll go down knowing we tried. Ethan's phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Chen. Maya asking when you'll be home. Should I tell her tonight or tomorrow? Tonight, he typed back. I'll be home tonight. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences came from this morning's testimony, he'd be there to face them with his daughter beside him. And somehow, that made everything else bearable. The flight back to the city felt longer than it should have, stretched out by anticipation and the strange hollow feeling that came after adrenaline faded. Ethan sat by the window, watching Chicago shrink beneath him, then disappear into clouds, replaced eventually by the familiar geography of home. 3 hours in the air to think about what he'd done, what it might cost, what it might mean. 3 hours to second-guess every word he'd spoken in that conference room, every choice that had led him to this moment. His phone stayed in his pocket, airplane mode activated, a temporary shield from whatever consequences were already gathering like storm clouds. He knew there would be emails waiting. Knew that Richard Halloway wouldn't go quietly into suspension, that men like him fought back with lawyers and connections and all the institutional power they'd accumulated over decades of climbing. Knew that by the time he landed, the story would have spread through Meridian like wildfire. The COO accusing the CFO of embezzlement, some nobody, IT guy backing her up, the whole company holding its breath to see who'd survive. The woman in the seat next to him tried to make conversation during the first hour, asked what brought him to Chicago, if he was there for business or pleasure. Ethan had answered in monosyllables until she gave up, put in her headphones, left him alone with thoughts that circled and circled without ever quite landing on solid ground. Was he brave or stupid? Principled or reckless? A man teaching his daughter about integrity or a father about to teach her about unemployment? The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers announcing their descent, and Ethan's stomach tightened. In 30 minutes, he'd be on the ground. In 45, he'd be through baggage claim. In an hour, he'd be holding Maya, feeling her small arms around his neck, her weight solid and real against him. And he'd have to decide what to tell her, how much of the truth a 7-year-old could handle, how to explain that sometimes doing the right thing meant making life harder instead of easier. He switched his phone off airplane mode as the wheels touched tarmac. It buzzed immediately, notifications flooding in like water through a broken dam. Emails from HR. A message from his direct supervisor asking him to call as soon as possible. 3 texts from colleagues he barely knew, curiosity barely disguised as concern. And one from Claire, sent 2 hours ago while he was somewhere over Indiana with no way to respond. The text was simple. Thank you. Regardless of what happens next, thank you for showing up. Ethan didn't respond. What could he say? You're welcome for potentially destroying my life? No problem. Happy to help torpedo my career for a stranger? He pocketed the phone and deplaned, moving through the terminal in a daze, the fluorescent lights too bright, the crowd too loud, everything feeling slightly unreal like he was watching himself from outside his own body. Mrs. Chen was waiting at his apartment when he arrived, Maya already bathed and in pajamas even though it was only 7:30. His daughter launched herself at him the moment he opened the door, and Ethan caught her, lifted her up, buried his face in her hair that smelled like the strawberry shampoo Jessica had bought in bulk before she left, and they were still working through years later. "Daddy, you're home. Did you bring me a present?" The question was pure Maya, unself-conscious and hopeful, and it made Ethan's chest ache. "Not this time, Bug. The trip was shorter than I expected." Her face fell for just a moment, then brightened again with the resilience of childhood. "That's okay. Mrs. Chen let me have ice cream for dessert, and we watched the dinosaur movie, the one with the T-Rex. Sounds like you had a good time." "I did, but I missed you. A lot. She squeezed him tighter. "You're not going away again, right?" "Not for a while," Ethan promised, hoping it was true, hoping he'd still have a job that required travel, hoping he hadn't just thrown away the stability that made promises possible. Mrs. Chen gathered her things, declined payment for the extra day with the gentle firmness of someone who'd decided this was charity, not business, and left with instructions to call if he needed anything. The door clicked shut, and suddenly it was just Ethan and Maya in the small apartment that was all he could afford, surrounded by furniture from thrift stores and toys from clearance sales and all the evidence of a life built on the margins of solvency. "Are you okay, Daddy?" Maya asked, her 7-year-old perception picking up something in his posture, his tone, the way he held her just a little too tight. "You seem sad." "I'm not sad, Bug, just tired. It was a long trip." "Did work make you tired or flying make you tired?" "Both," Ethan thought. "Neither. Something else entirely that he couldn't explain to a child who still thought her father was invincible." "Work," he said. "But I'm home now, and that's what matters." He made her hot chocolate even though she'd already brushed her teeth, let her stay up past bedtime curled against him on the couch, while he pretended to watch her dinosaur movie and actually stared at his phone, reading through the emails he'd been avoiding. HR wanted to schedule a meeting for Monday morning. His supervisor, Greg, had sent 3 increasingly urgent messages asking what the hell had happened in Chicago and whether Ethan was aware he'd just testified against the CFO. A company-wide memo announced that Richard Halloway was on administrative leave pending an internal review, language so carefully neutral it revealed nothing while suggesting everything. And buried in the professional correspondence, one personal email from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "Be careful." Ethan opened it despite his better judgment. "Mr. Brooks, you don't know me, but I know what you did in Chicago. I'm writing to warn you that Richard Halloway has friends in places you wouldn't expect. Legal friends, political friends, the kind who can make life very difficult for people who threaten him. I'm not trying to scare you, just giving you information you deserve to have. Whatever the audit finds, Richard won't go down without a fight. And when men like him fight, they don't care about collateral damage. Protect yourself. Protect your daughter. And maybe talk to a lawyer before Monday's meeting with HR." The email was unsigned, untraceable. The digital equivalent of a warning note slipped under a door. Ethan read it twice, his skin crawling with the implications. Someone was watching. Someone knew what he'd done and was either trying to help or trying to frighten him into silence. Either way, the message was clear. This wasn't over. "Daddy, you're not watching." Maya poked his arm, drawing his attention back to the screen where animated dinosaurs were doing something that would have delighted her if he'd been paying attention. "The T-Rex is about to fight the Spinosaurus. This is the best part." Ethan put his phone face down on the couch and focused on his daughter, on the way her eyes widened during the dramatic parts, the way she whispered the dialogue along with the characters, the absolute certainty in her posture that good would triumph and the heroes would survive. He wanted to preserve that certainty, that faith in narrative justice where right prevailed and wrong got punished. But the email sat between them like a grenade with the pin pulled, ticking down toward an explosion he couldn't prevent. When the movie ended, Ethan carried Maya to bed, tucked her in with the stuffed triceratops that had been her constant companion since age 4, kissed her forehead with the fierce protectiveness that parenthood had taught him was both a strength and a vulnerability. "Daddy?" Her voice was sleepy, drifting. "Are you going to be here when I wake up?" "I'm going to be here," he promised. "Right here, like always." "Good. I don't like when you're gone." "I don't like it either, Bug." She was asleep within minutes, her breathing evening out into the gentle rhythm of childhood rest. Ethan stood in her doorway for a long time, watching her sleep, thinking about the email and the audit and all the ways this could still go catastrophically wrong. He thought testifying was the hard part, the moment of choice that would define everything. But he was beginning to understand that testimony was just the beginning. The consequences had their own timeline, their own momentum, and once you set them in motion, you couldn't control where they'd land. He spent the weekend in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of normal life while waiting for the other shoe to drop. Saturday morning, he took Maya to the park, pushed her on the swings, helped her across the monkey bars, watched her play with other kids whose fathers weren't waiting for their careers to implode. Saturday afternoon, he did laundry and meal prep and all the domestic tasks that filled single parenthood with endless small responsibilities. Saturday night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, playing out scenarios in his head, each one worse than the last. Sunday morning, he found the envelope. It was slipped under his apartment door sometime during the night, standard legal size, his name typed on the front with no return address. Ethan's hands shook as he opened it, half expecting a lawsuit or a termination notice or some other legal catastrophe. Instead, he found a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. Mr. Brooks, my name is Jennifer Reeves. I'm an employment attorney specializing in whistleblower protection and wrongful termination cases. A mutual friend suggested you might benefit from legal representation in the coming weeks. I'd like to offer you a free consultation to discuss your rights and options. My direct number is below. Please call me before your Monday meeting with HR. What you did in Chicago took courage. Let me help you make sure that courage doesn't destroy you. The note included a phone number and an email address. Ethan read it 3 times, trying to parse whether this was genuine help or some elaborate trap. Who was the mutual friend? How did this attorney know about Monday's HR meeting? How had she found his apartment? But even as the questions multiplied, he felt something loosen in his chest. Someone was offering help. Someone who understood employment law and whistleblower protection and all the technical details he didn't know how to navigate. Someone who might be able to shield him from whatever Richard Halloway was planning. He called the number at 9 a.m. Sunday morning, expecting voicemail, getting instead a woman's voice that was warm and professional and immediately put him at ease. Mr. Brooks, thank you for calling. I know you must have questions. Starting with who gave you my information and how you found my apartment. Jennifer Reeves laughed, not unkindly. Claire Monroe reached out to me Friday afternoon. We've worked together before on employment disputes. She thought you might need representation and asked if I'd be willing to take your case pro bono if necessary. As for your apartment, that was just basic research, public records. I'm thorough, not creepy, I promise. Claire hired you to represent me? Not hired, recommended. Whether you want representation is entirely up to you, but I've reviewed what information Claire provided about the situation, and Mr. Brooks, you're in a precarious position. You testified against a senior executive. You confirmed evidence of potential embezzlement. You made yourself a target for retaliation. HR meetings that get scheduled this quickly after whistleblower testimony rarely end well for the whistleblower. So I'm about to be fired. Not if I'm in the room with you. Federal law protects whistleblowers from retaliation. If Meridian terminates you or demotes you or changes your working conditions in response to your testimony, they're opening themselves up to serious legal consequences. But they'll only back off if they know you're represented by counsel who understands those protections. Ethan sank onto his couch, relief and anxiety warring in his gut. I can't afford a lawyer. I can barely afford rent. Then it's a good thing I'm offering to represent you for free. Claire was very clear that you testified at significant personal risk and with no expectation of compensation. That kind of integrity is rare enough that I'm willing to donate my time to protect it. Why would you do that? Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Because 15 years ago, I was a junior associate who witnessed financial fraud at my firm. I reported it to the partners and got fired for my trouble. No one would hire me afterward because I'd earned a reputation as someone who couldn't be trusted to keep quiet about inconvenient truths. It took me 5 years to rebuild my career, and I swore that if I ever got the chance to help someone in the same position, I would. You're that someone, Mr. Brooks. Let me do for you what no one did for me. They talked for 40 minutes, Jennifer walking him through his rights, the legal protections available to whistleblowers, what to expect in Monday's HR meeting, how to respond to various scenarios without incriminating himself or waiving any protections. By the time they hung up, Ethan had agreed to let her represent him and felt something he hadn't felt since receiving Claire's text Thursday night: hope. Maya wandered out of her bedroom around 10, rumpled and sleepy, asking for pancakes. Ethan made them from scratch the way his mother had taught him, letting Maya crack the eggs and stir the batter, normal Sunday morning routines that felt almost possible again, now that he wasn't facing Monday alone. "Daddy, how come you keep checking your phone?" Maya asked through a mouthful of pancake and syrup. "Just work stuff, bug." "Is work making you worried?" God, she was perceptive. Too perceptive.
A little bit, but it's going to be okay. How do you know? Because I'm doing the right thing, and doing the right thing always works out eventually. Even as he said it, Ethan knew it was a lie, or at least a simplification so extreme it bordered on falsehood. Doing the right thing worked out in children's movies and fairy tales, in stories where morality and outcome aligned in satisfying ways. In real life, doing the right thing often meant suffering consequences while watching the wrong people prosper. But he couldn't tell that to Maya, couldn't poison her faith in justice before she was old enough to handle the complexity of a world that didn't care about fairness. So he smiled and made more pancakes and pretended that everything was fine, that Monday wouldn't bring confrontation and potential disaster, that testimony and truth were shields strong enough to protect them.
The weekend ended the way weekends always did, with Sunday night anxiety and the looming weight of Monday morning. Ethan put Maya to bed early, laid out her school clothes, packed her lunch, went through all the rituals of parental preparation. Then he sat at his laptop and composed an email to Jennifer Reeves, confirming that he wanted her present at Monday's HR meeting, attaching the usage reports he'd mentioned in his testimony, documenting everything he could think of that might be relevant to his defense. At midnight, he finally tried to sleep, his mind still racing through scenarios and outcomes and all the ways this could still go wrong. When his alarm went off at 6:30 Monday morning, he felt like he'd barely closed his eyes, exhaustion sitting behind his eyelids like sand. But he got up anyway, showered, dressed in his best suit, the same one he'd worn in Chicago, because he only owned one, and prepared to walk into whatever trap HR had prepared for him. Mrs. Chen arrived at 7:30 to stay with Maya until the school bus came. Ethan kissed his daughter goodbye, told her he loved her, tried not to let her see the fear that was making his hands shake. "You'll be here when I get home from school?" Maya asked, the same question she'd asked Friday night, the same need for reassurance that her world was stable. "I'll be here," Ethan promised, hoping it was true, praying he wouldn't come home to tell her that Daddy had lost his job because he'd tried to do the right thing. The Meridian Financial Group headquarters was a glass and steel monument to corporate ambition, 40 stories of reflected sky and architectural assertion. Ethan had worked here for 3 years and still felt like a trespasser every time he walked through the lobby, past the security desk, into the elevator that would take him to the 14th floor, where IT support lived alongside human resources and facilities management. All the unsexy infrastructure that kept the company running but never got mentioned in earnings calls. Jennifer Reeves was waiting in the lobby, exactly as they'd arranged. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 40, dressed in a charcoal suit that managed to be both professional and slightly aggressive, her dark hair pulled back in a style that said she meant business. She shook his hand with a grip that was firm without being performative. "Ready?" she asked. "No." "Good. Overconfidence gets people in trouble. Nervous awareness keeps them sharp." She gestured toward the elevators. "Remember what we discussed. Answer questions directly, but don't volunteer information. If they ask anything about your testimony, refer them to me. If they threaten termination, stay calm. Getting emotional gives them ammunition. Your job is to be professional, composed, and to let me handle the legal positioning." They rode the elevator in silence, Ethan's reflection in the polished doors showing a man who looked older than 34, tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix. Jennifer stood beside him, radiating confidence, and he tried to borrow some of it, tried to believe that legal protection and federal whistleblower statutes would be enough to shield him from Richard Halloway's revenge. The HR office was on the 14th floor, a warren of cubicles and conference rooms decorated in aggressive neutrality. Ethan had been here once before, 3 years ago during his initial onboarding, and nothing had changed. Same motivational posters about teamwork and excellence, Same artificial plants that never needed watering. Same sense that this was where careers came to be processed, reduced to files and forms and administrative decisions. Rebecca Chen, the Director of Human Resources, met them in the lobby with a smile that was professionally warm and personally meaningless. She was in her 50s, Chinese-American, known for being fair but inflexible, the kind of HR director who followed policy to the letter whether it helped or hurt the people she was supposed to protect. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for coming in, and you are—" She looked at Jennifer with polite confusion. "Jennifer Reeves, Mr. Brooks's legal counsel. I'll be sitting in on this meeting." Rebecca's smile didn't falter, but something shifted behind her eyes. "That won't be necessary. This is just a routine check-in to discuss Mr. Brooks's recent business travel." "Then you won't mind if I observe this routine check-in," Jennifer said pleasantly. "For Mr. Brooks' protection and your own." For a moment, Rebecca looked like she wanted to object. Then she nodded. "Of course. Follow me." She led them to a small conference room, windows facing the street 14 floors below. A table that could seat 6 but currently only held 3 folders arranged with geometric precision. Rebecca sat on one side, Ethan and Jennifer on the other, positions established like pieces on a board before the game began. "Mr. Brooks, we've received reports about events that occurred during the Chicago corporate retreat. Specifically, that you provided testimony at an emergency board meeting regarding server usage reports and allegations of financial misconduct." "That's correct," Ethan said. "Were you instructed by your supervisor to attend that meeting or provide that testimony?" "No." "Were you requested to do so by Miss Monroe, the COO?" Ethan glanced at Jennifer, who gave a slight nod. "Yes." "And did you understand that your testimony might have significant implications for company operations and executive personnel?" "I understood that I was confirming what the server usage reports showed. That's all." Rebecca made a note in one of the folders. "Mr. Brooks, your position is IT Support Specialist Level 2. Your job description includes server maintenance, user support, and technical troubleshooting. It does not include participation in executive board meetings or involvement in financial investigations. Would you agree with that assessment?" "I would agree that executive board meetings aren't part of my normal responsibilities, but I was asked to testify about technical data that fell within my area of expertise by an executive who was making serious allegations against another executive, allegations that have resulted in administrative leave, an expensive audit, and significant disruption to company operations." Rebecca's voice remained neutral, but her meaning was clear. "You stepped out of line. You caused problems. Now there are consequences." "My client was asked to provide factual testimony about server data," Jennifer interjected smoothly. "He did so accurately and professionally. Federal whistleblower protection laws explicitly protect employees who provide truthful information about potential corporate fraud, regardless of whether that information is solicited or volunteered. Any adverse employment action taken against Mr. Brooks in response to his testimony would constitute illegal retaliation." Rebecca turned her attention to Jennifer. "No one is suggesting adverse employment action, Ms. Reeves. We're simply trying to understand how an IT support specialist ended up testifying at a board meeting about embezzlement allegations. Because the COO asked him to confirm technical data, because he had access to information relevant to the investigation, because telling the truth about what the server logs showed was the correct and legal thing to do." Jennifer's voice was calm but unmistakably firm. "If this meeting is truly just a routine check-in, then I'm sure we can wrap it up quickly. If it's something else, I'd appreciate clarity about what Mr. Brooks is actually being accused of." The room went silent, tension stretched tight between professional courtesy and barely concealed hostility. Rebecca looked at her folders, at Ethan, at Jennifer, calculating something in the mathematics of corporate politics and legal exposure. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Brooks, the company appreciates your commitment to accuracy and transparency. However, we need to ensure that all employees understand appropriate boundaries and chains of command. Going forward, any requests from executives for testimony or information outside your normal job duties should be cleared through your direct supervisor and this office. Is that understood?" "Understood," Ethan said. "Good. Then this meeting is concluded. You may return to your normal duties." just like that. No termination, no demotion, no consequences beyond a gentle warning wrapped in bureaucratic language. Ethan stood, his legs unsteady with relief, and followed Jennifer out of the conference room, down the hallway, into the elevator before either of them spoke. "What just happened?" he asked. Jennifer smiled. They blinked. They know they can't fire you without massive legal exposure, so they're trying to intimidate you into compliance instead. The warning about clearing future testimony through HR is bullshit. You're not required to do that, and they know it. But they wanted you scared enough to think twice before testifying again. So I won. You survived round one. There will be others. The elevator reached the lobby, and they stepped out into the atrium, morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard Halloway hasn't been fired yet. The audit is still ongoing. If they find what Claire thinks they'll find, he'll escalate his retaliation. If they don't, he'll come after both of you with everything he has. This isn't over, Ethan. It's barely started. She left him with her business card and instructions to call immediately if anything else happened. If HR contacted him again, if he received any threats or noticed any changes to his job duties or working conditions. Ethan pocketed the card and took the elevator up to the IT department on the 22nd floor, to the cubicle he'd occupied for 3 years, to the normal routine of fixing computers and resetting passwords and being invisible again. Except he wasn't invisible anymore. People stared as he walked past. Conversation stopped when he entered the break room. Everyone knew what he had done, and no one quite knew how to treat him, like a hero or a liability, like someone brave or someone stupid, like a colleague or a cautionary tale. His supervisor, Greg, called him into his office at 10:30, closed the door, and looked at him with an expression somewhere between admiration and exasperation. "What the hell were you thinking?" Greg asked. "I was thinking the CFO was embezzling money and someone needed to say so. That someone didn't have to be you. You could have kept your head down, stayed out of it, protected your job." "I know." Greg sighed, ran his hand through thinning hair, looked like a man who'd climbed halfway up a corporate ladder and gotten stuck there, comfortable enough not to risk falling, but not high enough to forget what the bottom looked like. "I get it. I do. If I was younger, maybe I'd have done the same thing. But you have a kid, Ethan. Responsibilities. You can't afford to be a martyr." "Lucky." "I'm not trying to be a martyr. I'm just trying to be honest." "Well, your honesty just painted a target on your back the size of Lake Michigan." Greg leaned back in his chair. "Off the record? I'm glad you did it. Someone needed to stand up to Halloway. But on the record, watch yourself. Keep documentation of everything. If your job duties change, if anyone gives you negative performance reviews, if anything feels like retaliation, document it and report it to HR and your lawyer, because they're going to come after you, and they're going to be subtle about it." Ethan spent the rest of the day at his desk, doing routine work, answering routine tickets, trying to feel normal even though everything had changed. At lunch, he checked his phone and found a text from Claire. "Claire, heard you had an HR meeting this morning. How did it go?" Ethan, "Survived. Your lawyer friend is terrifying in the best way." Claire, "Good. The audit team started this morning. They're going through everything, should have preliminary findings by end of week." Ethan, "And if they find what you think they'll find?" Claire, "Then Richard goes to prison and we get to keep our jobs. If they don't..." She didn't finish the thought, didn't need to. They both knew what failure meant. Ethan picked Maya up from school at 3:30, watched her run toward him with her backpack bouncing and her gap-toothed smile bright as sunlight, felt the fierce love that came with parenthood settle over him like armor. She chattered about her day, about the substitute teacher who let them have extra recess, about the boy who'd brought a snake for show and tell, about the math worksheet that was too easy and the spelling test that was too hard, and Ethan listened like his life depended on it, anchoring himself in the mundane details of her world where the biggest crisis was whether she'd get picked for kickball at lunch. That night he made her favorite dinner, macaroni and cheese from a box with frozen peas mixed in because he'd learned to hide vegetables where he could. They ate at the small kitchen table, Maya swinging her legs and telling him more stories, and Ethan tried to memorize this moment, this ordinary evening that might be one of the last before everything fell apart or miraculously held together. Daddy, why do you keep looking sad? Maya asked, her fork paused halfway to her mouth. I'm not sad, Bug. Just thinking. About work? Yeah, about work. Is work hard right now? A little bit, but it's going to be okay. Maya considered this with the seriousness of a child who was learning that adults didn't always have all the answers. Mrs. Patterson says that doing the right thing is always hard, but it's still right. Who's Mrs. Patterson? My teacher. She said that in class when Billy pushed Emma and then told the truth about it, even though he knew he'd get in trouble. She said telling the truth is brave. Ethan felt something crack open in his chest, love and pain, and the recognition that his daughter was teaching him lessons he thought he'd been teaching her. Mrs. Patterson is right. So if work is hard because you did the right thing, that means you were brave like Billy. I guess it does. Maya smiled, satisfied with this logic, and went back to her macaroni. And Ethan sat across from her, watching her eat, thinking that maybe Jennifer was right, and this wasn't over. That maybe Greg was right, and he'd painted a target on himself. That maybe he was an idiot who'd risked everything for a principle most people abandoned by kindergarten. But his daughter thought he was brave, and somehow, sitting in their small apartment eating boxed macaroni and frozen peas, that felt like enough. The week crawled forward with the peculiar slowness of waiting for a verdict, each day stretching longer than the last while Ethan went through the motions of normal work and tried not to check his phone every 5 minutes for updates that never came. The audit team had taken over a conference room on the executive floor, bringing with them boxes of files and portable monitors and the kind of grim determination that came with following money trails through deliberate obfuscation. Claire texted him once on Wednesday to say they were being thorough, which could mean promising or could mean nothing, and Ethan had learned not to ask for details he wouldn't understand anyway. At work, people had stopped staring quite so obviously, but the whispers continued in break rooms and elevators. Speculation about what the audit would find, whether Holloway was guilty or Claire was delusional, whether the IT guy who'd testified was brave or just stupid. Ethan kept his head down, fixed computers, reset passwords, tried to be invisible again, even though invisibility was no longer an option. You couldn't testify at a board meeting and then disappear back into the wallpaper. The stain of visibility was permanent. Thursday afternoon, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Ethan almost let it go to voicemail, then remembered Jennifer's instructions to document everything, stay alert for anything unusual. He answered. Mr. Brooks? The voice was male, professional, unfamiliar. This is Detective Marcus Wright with the Chicago Police Department, Financial Crimes Division. I'm calling regarding your testimony in the Meridian Financial Group matter. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Ethan's stomach dropped. Police. This had escalated from internal audit to criminal investigation, which meant they'd found something, which meant Richard Holloway was in serious trouble, which meant the retaliation Greg had warned about was probably coming soon. I have a few minutes. Great. I wanted to confirm some details about the server usage reports you mentioned in your testimony. You stated that these reports showed a folder belonging to Claire Monroe that contained 47 files and exhibited access patterns consistent with a 6-month investigation. Is that accurate? Yes. And these reports are automatically generated, not something that could be easily falsified. They're automatically generated by the system and stored in multiple redundant locations. You'd need root-level access to the entire server infrastructure to fake them, and even then it would leave digital fingerprints that a forensic analysis would catch. Good. That's consistent with what our technical consultants told us. Papers rustled in the background. Mr. Brooks, I want you to know that the audit team found significant evidence of financial irregularities in Mr. Holloway's department. Systematic transfers to shell accounts, falsified expense reports, manipulation of quarterly projections to hide the missing funds. We're looking at embezzlement in the range of $900,000 over approximately 18 months. $900,000. Not quite the million Claire had estimated, but close enough that Ethan felt vindication and terror in equal measure. She'd been right. Richard Holloway was a thief, and Ethan had helped prove it, which made him either a hero or a target depending on who you asked. What happens now? Ethan asked. Now we build a case. The district attorney's office will review the evidence and determine whether to file criminal charges. Given the amount involved and the sophistication of the scheme, I'd say charges are likely. But these things take time. Could be weeks, could be months before we move forward. In the meantime, I'd advise you to be cautious. Men facing serious financial crimes charges sometimes do desperate things. Desperate like what? Like trying to discredit witnesses, like making accusations of their own to muddy the waters, like using their resources and connections to make life difficult for the people who exposed them. Detective Wright's voice was kind but firm. I'm not trying to scare you, Mr. Brooks. I'm trying to prepare you. You did the right thing, but the right thing doesn't always protect you from consequences. They talked for another 10 minutes, Wright asking technical questions about the server infrastructure and file access protocols, Ethan answering as clearly as he could, both of them dancing around the central truth that this was now a criminal matter, and Ethan was a witness in a case that could send a powerful man to prison. When they hung up, Ethan sat at his desk staring at his computer screen without seeing it, trying to process the fact that his testimony in a hotel conference room had set in motion events that now involved police detectives and district attorneys and the machinery of criminal justice. He called Jennifer immediately, relayed the conversation, listened to her measured response that this was good news in terms of validating his testimony, but complicated news in terms of his ongoing safety and employment. Criminal charges will take the heat off you in some ways, she said. Meridian won't want to be seen retaliating against a witness in a criminal case. But it also raises the stakes for Holloway. He's not just fighting for his job anymore. He's fighting to stay out of prison. People in that position get unpredictable. Should I be worried about my safety? My daughter's safety? I don't think he'll get physically violent if that's what you're asking. But he might try other approaches. Harassment, intimidation, digging into your background to find anything he can use against you. Document everything, Ethan. Every phone call, every email, every conversation that feels even slightly off. If this goes to trial, you'll need that documentation. That night, Ethan barely slept, his mind cycling through scenarios where Richard Holloway sent lawyers or private investigators or hired goons to his apartment, where Maya got caught in the crossfire of adult consequences she couldn't understand, where doing the right thing ended up destroying everything he'd built. At 2 a.m, he got up, checked the locks on the doors and windows, looked in on Maya sleeping peacefully in her bed, wondered when he'd become the kind of person who thought in terms of threats and retaliation and protective measures. Friday morning brought the news he'd been both expecting and dreading. An email from Rebecca Chen in HR, subject line reading, "Change in assignment," body text explaining in carefully neutral language that due to operational needs, Ethan was being temporarily reassigned from general IT support to a special project involving legacy system documentation. The work would be performed in a different building, different hours, different supervisor. Effective immediately. Ethan read the email 3 times, rage building with each pass. This was retaliation dressed up as operational necessity. They were moving him away from the main office, away from colleagues who might notice if his working conditions deteriorated, away from anything resembling his normal job duties. Legacy system documentation was code for busy work, for meaningless tasks designed to justify employment while actually accomplishing nothing. They couldn't fire him, so they were burying him instead. He forwarded the email to Jennifer with a 1-line message. "Is this legal?" Her response came within minutes. "Borderline. It's subtle enough that they can claim legitimate business reasons, but the timing is suspicious. Accept the reassignment, but document everything. Keep records of your actual work tasks versus your job description. If they're setting you up for a performance-based termination, we'll need evidence that the performance issues were manufactured." The special project turned out to be exactly as pointless as Ethan had feared. A converted storage room in an auxiliary building 3 blocks from headquarters, 1 desk, 1 computer, boxes and boxes of documentation for systems that had been decommissioned years ago. Dates. His new supervisor was a man named Paul, who looked embarrassed to be involved in this charade, who gave Ethan vague instructions about cataloging the old files and then disappeared for hours at a time, clearly as uncomfortable with the situation as Ethan was. By lunch on his first day in the new assignment, Ethan understood what they were doing. They were isolating him, removing him from the normal flow of company life, from the colleagues who might support him, from the visibility that made retaliation harder to execute. In this converted storage room, he was invisible again, but not in the protective way he'd been before. Now he was invisible, like evidence being buried, like a problem being hidden until everyone forgot it existed. He texted Claire during his lunch break. They reassigned me to legacy documentation in a storage room. This is retaliation, right? Her response was immediate. Absolutely, but expected. They're doing the same thing to me, just more subtly. I've been cut out of executive meetings, my project approvals are being delayed. My assistant was reassigned. They can't fire us, so they're making us irrelevant instead. Do we fight it? We endure it. The criminal investigation is moving forward. Once charges are filed, the company will have to distance itself from Holloway completely. Until then, we keep our heads down and wait. Waiting turned out to be its own form of torture. Ethan spent his days in the storage room cataloging files that didn't matter, eating lunch alone, going home to Maya, and trying to pretend that work was fine, that nothing was wrong, that her father wasn't slowly being erased from professional existence. The weekends were worse because there was no pretense of normalcy, just long hours of watching Maya play and wondering how much longer he could afford the apartment, whether he should start looking for another job, whether anyone would hire someone who'd testified against their CFO. 2 weeks after his reassignment, Claire called him on a Saturday morning, her voice tight with controlled excitement. The DA filed charges: wire fraud, embezzlement, falsification of corporate records. Richard was arrested this morning. It's done, Ethan. He's going to trial. Relief flooded through Ethan so fast it left him dizzy. Done. The word felt impossible, too simple for the weeks of anxiety and isolation and fear. What happens to us now? I don't know yet. The board is meeting Monday to discuss the situation. With Richard facing criminal charges, they can't exactly keep punishing us for exposing him. But corporate memory is long, and we made powerful people uncomfortable. It might take time for things to normalize. How much time? I honestly don't know. The weekend passed in a blur of cautious optimism and lingering dread. Maya asked why he seemed happier, and Ethan told her work had gotten better, which was maybe true or maybe wishful thinking. On Sunday night, he got an email from Rebecca Chen requesting a meeting Monday morning, and his stomach dropped back into familiar territory of anxiety and anticipation. Jennifer met him in the lobby again, same charcoal suit, same professional intensity. Whatever they say in this meeting, remember that criminal charges change everything. They can't afford to look like they're retaliating against a witness who helped expose criminal activity. They'll be conciliatory, maybe even apologetic. Don't let your guard down. The meeting was in the same conference room as before, same geometric precision of folders on the table, same professionally neutral expression on Rebecca's face, but something had shifted in the power dynamics. She wasn't quite deferential, but she wasn't dismissive either. Ethan and his lawyer had become people who required careful handling. Mr. Brooks, thank you for coming in. I wanted to discuss your work assignment and address some concerns that have been raised about your recent transfer to the legacy documentation project. Concerns by whom? Jennifer asked. By Mr. Brooks' former supervisor and several colleagues who felt the reassignment was inappropriate given his performance record and skill level. After reviewing the circumstances, we agree that the transfer may not have been in the best interests of the company or Mr. Brooks. Ethan blinked. They were backtracking, actually admitting the reassignment was wrong. So I'm being moved back to my original position? Not exactly. We're offering you a promotion to IT Systems Analyst, Level 1. It comes with a 15% salary increase, expanded responsibilities, and a position on the Infrastructure Planning Committee. The role would put you back in the main office with a team of colleagues and direct reporting to the Director of Information Technology rather than a mid-level supervisor. The room went silent. Ethan looked at Jennifer, who looked equally surprised but was hiding it better. This wasn't just a reversal of the punitive reassignment. This was a reward, an acknowledgement that they'd screwed up, that Ethan had been right, that he deserved better than what they'd given him. Why? Ethan asked. Why now? Rebecca chose her words carefully. The company recognizes that you provided valuable information that helped uncover serious financial crimes. We also recognize that the aftermath of your testimony may have created uncomfortable working conditions. This promotion is our way of ensuring that employees who demonstrate integrity and commitment to corporate ethics are recognized and rewarded appropriately. Translation: they were covering their asses, making sure that when this went to trial, when the media coverage started, When people asked what happened to the whistleblower who'd exposed the embezzlement, Meridian could point to a promotion and a raise and say they'd done right by him. It was calculated and cynical, and Ethan didn't care because it was also a 15% raise, an actual job security, and an escape from the storage room where they'd tried to bury him. "I accept," he said. Rebecca smiled, genuine relief crossing her face. "Excellent. We'll process the paperwork today. You can start in your new role Monday. Your new supervisor, Karen Gonzalez, will reach out to schedule an orientation meeting." They wrapped up the meeting with handshakes and professional pleasantries, and Ethan walked out of the building feeling like he'd survived something that should have destroyed him, but hadn't. Jennifer walked him to the street corner where they'd part ways, her expression thoughtful. "That went better than expected," she said. "They're just protecting themselves from a lawsuit." "Of course they are. But the result is the same. You get a promotion, better pay, an actual career path. Take the win, Ethan. Not many whistleblowers come out ahead." "What about Claire?" "Claire is COO. They can't exactly promote her higher without making her CEO, which won't happen. But my guess is they'll restore her to full authority and make a show of valuing her judgment. She'll be fine. You both will." Jennifer left him with another reminder to call if anything else happened, and Ethan stood on the corner watching traffic move through downtown streets, people going about their lives completely unaware that his life had just shifted from disaster to something almost resembling success. A promotion, 15% raise. That was real money. Enough to build savings again, maybe even enough to move to a bigger apartment where Maya could have her own room instead of the cramped space they'd been sharing. He called Claire from the street corner, needing to share the news with someone who'd understand what it meant. She answered on the second ring. "They promoted me," Ethan said. "Systems analyst, 15% raise." "Oh, thank God!" Claire's voice broke slightly, relief and exhaustion mixing into something raw. "I was so worried they'd find a way to punish you even after the charges were filed. This is good, Ethan. This is really good." "What about you? Have they said anything?" "I'm meeting with the board tomorrow. Douglas Pierce called me personally to apologize for doubting my accusations and to assure me that I have the full support of the board moving forward, which is corporate speak for, 'We're sorry we almost let a criminal destroy your career.'" They talked for a few more minutes, sharing details and relief and the strange vertigo that came with crisis ending not in disaster, but in something close to vindication. When they hung up, Ethan stood on the corner a moment longer, then started walking. Not back to the auxiliary building where the storage room waited, not to his apartment where Maya was at school and Mrs. Chen was probably doing laundry. Just walking through downtown streets, letting the reality of what had happened settle into his bones. He testified against one of the most powerful men in the company. He'd risked his career and his daughter's stability for a principle most people would have abandoned. He'd spent weeks in isolation and fear and uncertainty. And somehow, improbably, impossibly, it had worked. The truth had mattered. Integrity had counted for something. Doing the right thing had led to consequences that were actually positive instead of catastrophic. Ethan stopped at a bike shop on his way home, the kind of impulse decision he never allowed himself because money was always too tight and needs always outweighed wants. But today, with a promotion coming and a raise and the feeling that maybe his life could be something more than just survival, he walked in and looked at children's bikes. Found one that was purple with streamers on the handlebars and training wheels that could be removed once she got confident. The price made him wince but didn't break him, and he bought it anyway, had them put it in a box so he could surprise Maya after school. Mrs. Chen was folding laundry when he got home, the apartment smelling like detergent and the vanilla candle she always lit when she cleaned. She looked up in surprise when he came through the door carrying a large box. "You're home early. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine." "Better than fine." Ethan set the box down in the living room, suddenly nervous about Maya's reaction, about whether this was the right gesture, whether a bike could somehow convey everything he wanted to tell her about courage and consequences and the complicated truth that sometimes doing the right thing actually worked out. "I got a promotion, a real one. Better pay, better position." Mrs. Chen's face broke into a smile that made her look 10 years younger. "Ethan, that's wonderful. You deserve it. After everything you've been through these past few weeks, you deserve good news." I wasn't sure I'd get it. Wasn't sure anything good would come from what I did. Good things come to good people, Mrs. Chen said with the certainty of someone who'd lived through her own share of hardship and come out believing in cosmic justice anyway. Maybe not always on the timeline we want, but eventually. You did the right thing, and now you're being rewarded for it. That's how it should work. Ethan wanted to believe her, wanted to think the universe operated on principles of fairness and moral arithmetic where good deeds accumulated into good outcomes. But he knew it was more complicated than that, knew he'd been lucky in ways that mattered, knew that in a different company with a different board and a different set of circumstances, he'd be unemployed right now instead of promoted. But maybe that was okay. Maybe you didn't need to believe in cosmic justice to appreciate when things worked out. Maybe it was enough to recognize that this time, in this moment, the right choice had led somewhere good. Maya came home from school at 3:30, bursting through the door with her usual energy, talking about the field trip permission slip he needed to sign and the art project she'd made, and could they have pizza for dinner, please, please, please. Ethan let her chatter wash over him, waiting for the right moment, watching her drop her backpack and kick off her shoes and be gloriously, completely 7 years old. "Bug, I have something for you," he said when she finally paused for breath. "A present?" Her eyes went wide. "But it's not my birthday." "I know, but I got some good news at work today, and I wanted to celebrate with you." He brought out the box, helped her tear through the packaging, watched her face light up when she saw the purple bike with its streamers and bell, and everything she'd been asking for since her friend Emma got one for her birthday 3 months ago. Maya threw her arms around his neck with such force they both nearly toppled over, her 7-year-old body vibrating with excitement. "Thank you, thank you, thank you. Can we go ride it right now, please?" They spent the afternoon at the park, Ethan jogging beside the bike while Maya wobbled and shrieked and eventually found her balance, her gap-toothed smile bright enough to break his heart. Other parents watched from benches, some smiling at the scene, others absorbed in their own phones and children and private worlds. Ethan thought about how normal this looked from the outside, how ordinary. A father and daughter at the park on a Friday afternoon, nothing remarkable, nothing special. You couldn't see the weeks of fear and uncertainty and isolation that had preceded this moment, couldn't see the choice he'd made in a hotel room, or the testimony he'd given, or the career he'd nearly lost. Just a man pushing his daughter on a bike, laughing when she rang the bell, calling encouragement when she picked up speed. "Daddy, watch! I'm going fast!" Maya pedaled furiously, her training wheels keeping her upright, her face flushed with achievement. "I see you, Bug. You're doing great." She circled back to him, breathless and proud. "This is the best present ever. You're the best daddy ever." The words settled into Ethan's chest like warmth, like vindication, like proof that all of it, the fear and the risk and the sleepless nights, had been worth it. Not because he'd gotten promoted or because Richard Halloway was facing criminal charges or because the system had worked the way it was supposed to, but because his daughter thought he was the best daddy ever, and that meant something. That meant everything. They stayed at the park until the sun started setting, until Maya's energy finally flagged and she agreed it was time to go home. Ethan carried the bike while she walked beside him, still chattering about how fast she'd gone and how soon she could get the training wheels off and could they come back tomorrow to practice more. "We can come back," Ethan promised, "as many times as you want." That night, after Maya was bathed and fed and tucked into bed with her triceratops, Ethan sat on the couch and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. He'd stood up to power and survived. He'd risked everything for a principle and come out ahead. He'd taught his daughter that doing the right thing mattered, and then the world had actually proven him right instead of punishing him for his naivety. It wouldn't always work this way. He knew that. Knew that most of the time people who stood up got knocked down, that whistleblowers usually lost their careers, that the system protected the powerful more often than it punished them. He'd been lucky in ways that were neither guaranteed nor replicable. But for now, in this moment, he could let himself believe that courage counted for something and that the kind of man he wanted to be was the kind of man he actually was. His phone buzzed with a text from Claire. Just 3 words, but they carried weight. "We did it." Ethan typed back, "Yeah, we did." He set the phone down and closed his eyes, exhausted in the way that came after crisis ended, after adrenaline faded, after you finally let yourself stop bracing for disaster. In the morning, he'd start his new position, begin figuring out what being a systems analyst meant, navigate the strange territory of being visible in positive ways instead of invisible in protective ones. But tonight he could just sit here in his small apartment, listening to his daughter breathe in the next room, feeling the weight of fear lift for the first time in weeks. Outside, the city hummed with Friday night energy, people living their lives in all the complicated ways that humans did, making choices that would ripple forward into futures they couldn't predict. Ethan thought about all the moments that had led here. Claire's late-night text, his decision to show up, the testimony that had felt like jumping off a cliff, the weeks of wondering if he'd destroyed everything for nothing. Thought about how close he'd come to choosing differently, to protecting himself instead of telling the truth, to being the kind of man who valued survival over integrity. But he'd chosen courage over comfort, even when courage felt like stupidity and comfort felt like wisdom. And this time, just this once, that choice had led somewhere good, somewhere sustainable, somewhere that let him buy his daughter a bike and imagine a future that was more than just making it to the end of the month. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The new position came with a desk near a window on the 22nd floor, natural light streaming in during the afternoon shift, a view of the city that reminded Ethan daily how far he'd come from the storage room where they'd tried to bury him. His new supervisor, Karen Gonzalez, was a woman in her early 40s with sharp intelligence and no patience for corporate politics, who told him on his first day that she didn't care about the drama with Holloway, only whether he could do the work. Ethan found he could. The systems analyst role was challenging in ways that routine IT support hadn't been, requiring him to think strategically about infrastructure instead of just fixing immediate problems. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like his brain was actually engaged. The 15% raise showed up in his paycheck 2 weeks after the promotion, and Ethan stared at the direct deposit notification like it was written in a foreign language. More money than he'd seen in a single check since before Maya was born, enough that he didn't have to choose between paying the electric bill on time and buying groceries that weren't generic brand. He transferred half to savings immediately, a financial cushion he hadn't been able to build in years, then took Maya to the grocery store and let her pick out the cereal she actually wanted instead of the cheapest box on the shelf. "We can get the good one?" she asked, holding up a box of some cartoon-branded sugar monstrosity that Ethan would normally have vetoed on principle. "We can get the good one," he confirmed, and her smile was worth every artificial color and preservative. Life settled into a new rhythm, better than before, but not without complications. People at work still looked at him strangely sometimes, like they couldn't quite reconcile the quiet IT guy they'd ignored for 3 years with the person who'd testified against the CFO. Some treated him with wary respect, others avoided him entirely, uncomfortable with the reminder that corporate loyalty had limits, that sometimes individuals chose conscience over comfort. Ethan learned to navigate these dynamics, to be professionally friendly without expecting friendship, to understand that visibility came with costs, even when the outcomes were positive. 3 weeks after his promotion, the trial date was set for Richard Holloway. 6 months away, enough time for lawyers to maneuver and for pre-trial motions to play out, but concrete enough that it felt real. Ethan would have to testify again, this time in an actual courtroom with actual legal consequences, and the thought made his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Jennifer assured him it would be straightforward, that he'd just confirm what the server logs showed like he'd done at the board meeting, that his role was technical witness, not character assassin. But Ethan knew that Richard's lawyers would try to discredit him anyway, paint him as either incompetent or complicit, suggest his testimony was motivated by personal gain rather than professional integrity. "Let them try," Jennifer said when he voiced these concerns. "You've got documentation, expert corroboration, and a criminal investigation that validated everything you said. Plus, you're sympathetic. Single father, struggling to make ends meet, risked his career to tell the truth. Juries love that narrative." "I'm not a narrative," Ethan said, uncomfortable with being reduced to story beats and emotional appeal. "No, but you're also not just a technical witness. Like it or not, this case is going to be partly about character. Richard's character versus yours. His credibility versus yours. And you've got the advantage because you didn't steal $900,000.
Claire called him the same week the trial date was announced, asking if they could meet for coffee.
Not at the office where people would notice and speculate, but at a quiet place downtown where they could talk without performance or pretense. Ethan agreed, curious about what she wanted to discuss, whether this was about the trial or something else entirely. They met on a Saturday morning at a corner cafe that served overpriced lattes and had exposed brick walls designed to feel authentic while being completely manufactured. Claire was already there when Ethan arrived, sitting at a small table by the window, dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of her usual corporate armor. She looked different in casual clothes, younger somehow, more human, less like the untouchable COO and more like a woman in her late 30s who'd been through something difficult and survived. "Thanks for meeting me," she said as Ethan sat down. "I know weekends are precious when you have a daughter. Maya's at a friend's birthday party. I've got a couple hours." He ordered a coffee from the waitress who appeared with practiced efficiency, then looked at Claire directly. "What's this about?" "I wanted to apologize." Ethan blinked. "For what?" "For dragging you into this. For putting you in a position where you had to choose between your principles and your security. For not considering fully what testifying might cost you." Claire wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like she was trying to absorb its warmth. "I was desperate that night in Chicago. Desperate enough that I didn't think through the consequences for you, only the consequences for me. And that was selfish. You asked. I chose. That's not on you. Isn't it, though? I had power over you, even if I wasn't your direct supervisor. I was an executive asking a low-level employee to do something that could destroy his career. There's an inherent coercion in that dynamic, whether I intended it or not." Ethan considered this, the ethical complexity of choices made under pressure, the question of whether anyone could truly choose freely when the power differential was that extreme. "You gave me the option to say no. You told me you'd understand if I walked away. That's more than most executives would do. Still, I put you in an impossible position, and I'm sorry for that." They sat in silence for a moment, coffee cooling between them, the cafe filling with weekend morning people who had no idea they were sitting near two people who'd nearly lost everything for telling the truth. Outside, the city moved through its rhythms, cars and pedestrians, and the endless flow of urban life that continued regardless of individual drama. "The thing is," Ethan said slowly, "I'm not sorry I did it. It was terrifying, and it nearly destroyed me, and I spent weeks thinking I'd made the worst mistake of my life. But I'd do it again. Because the alternative was teaching my daughter that power always wins, and truth doesn't matter, and I couldn't live with that lesson." Claire smiled, sad and understanding. "You're a better person than I am. I'd like to say I did it for noble reasons, but honestly, I was just furious that Richard thought he could steal from the company and get away with it, that he thought I was stupid enough not to notice or too afraid to call him out. Fury works too, whatever gets you to the right choice. Does it count as the right choice if your motivations were selfish? I think it counts as the right choice if the outcome is just. Motivation is complicated. We all tell ourselves stories about why we do things, but at the end of the day, what matters is what we actually do, not the narrative we build around it." Claire looked at him with something like surprise. "That's remarkably philosophical for a Saturday morning. Single parenthood gives you a lot of time to think about ethics. Every choice you make is teaching your kids something about how the world works, makes you conscious of your own motivations in ways you wouldn't be otherwise." They talked for another hour, the conversation drifting from the trial to their respective futures. What came next now that the immediate crisis had passed? Claire admitted she was thinking about leaving Meridian once the trial was over, that the company had been tainted for her by how quickly they'd been willing to throw her under the bus to protect Richard. Ethan admitted he was thinking about going back to school, getting a degree in computer science properly instead of the patchwork self-education he'd cobbled together, maybe turning the systems analyst position into an actual career instead of just another job he'd stumbled into. "You should do it," Claire said. "You're smart enough, dedicated enough, and now you've got the financial stability to make it possible." It would mean night classes, less time with Maya, more years of struggling even with the raise. But it would also mean building something sustainable, a career that couldn't be taken away so easily, security that goes beyond one company's whims. She paused. "You risked everything to do the right thing once. Seems like you're capable of making hard choices when they matter. Ethan thought about this as they paid the check and walked out into the autumn morning, leaves starting to turn in the trees that lined the downtown streets. Hard choices when they mattered. That's what all of this had been, really, a series of hard choices that accumulated into a life, into the kind of person you were when tested. The trial preparation consumed more of his time as winter approached. Meetings with the district attorney's office, practice sessions where Jennifer grilled him with the same questions Richard's lawyers would ask, reviews of the server logs and technical documentation until Ethan could recite them in his sleep. The DA, a sharp woman named Patricia Morales, told him he was the key to the prosecution's case, that without his testimony confirming the evidence had existed, they'd have a much harder time proving Richard had destroyed it. "No pressure," she said with a wry smile. "But you're basically the linchpin of putting a white-collar criminal away for a decade." Ethan went home after these meetings feeling the weight of that responsibility, wondering how his life had gone from fixing computers to being a linchpin in a criminal prosecution. Maya noticed his distraction, asked why he was so quiet lately, and Ethan struggled to explain in 7-year-old terms that sometimes grown-ups had to do hard things, and it made them worried, but it was still important. "Like when I had to tell Mrs. Patterson that Billy was cheating on the spelling test?" Maya asked. "Yeah, Bug, exactly like that. But you said telling the truth was brave, and you're brave, right, Daddy?" "I'm trying to be. Then it'll be okay. Because brave people always win in the end." Ethan wished he had her certainty, her faith in narrative justice. But he smiled and agreed and let her believe that bravery was armor, instead of just the choice to act despite fear. The trial began in March, 6 months after Richard's arrest, in a courthouse downtown that looked like every courthouse in every legal drama. Marble and wood paneling and the weight of institutional authority pressed into architecture. Ethan testified on the third day, wearing his best suit, his hands steady even though his stomach was in knots. Patricia Morales walked him through the technical details with practiced efficiency, establishing his credibility and expertise, then having him confirm what the server logs showed. Richard's defense attorney, an expensive lawyer named Marcus Hammond, who specialized in white-collar cases, tried to poke holes in Ethan's testimony during cross-examination, suggested the logs could be misinterpreted, implied Ethan had a personal grudge against Richard, questioned whether someone with only 3 years of experience could really understand complex server architecture well enough to draw definitive conclusions. Ethan answered each question calmly, precisely, without defensiveness or anger. This was just data, just facts, just the truth delivered without embellishment or agenda. And when Hammond finally sat down, looking frustrated that he hadn't been able to rattle the witness, Ethan felt something like vindication. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Ethan followed the coverage in the news, watched Claire testify with the same controlled intensity she'd brought to that emergency board meeting, saw forensic accountants explain the money trail in detail that made even Ethan's eyes glaze over. The jury deliberated for 2 days, long enough that Ethan started to worry they were deadlocked, short enough that it suggested they'd been thorough rather than uncertain. The verdict came down on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on all counts: wire fraud, embezzlement, falsification of records. Richard Halloway stood emotionless as the verdicts were read, his expensive lawyer already talking about appeals, but everyone in the courtroom knew this was over. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 months out, but Patricia Morales told the press she'd be recommending the maximum, 10 to 12 years in federal prison. Ethan heard the news at work, watched it scroll across his computer screen like just another headline, except this one had his name in it as a key witness who'd helped secure the conviction. His colleagues treated him with something approaching awe the rest of the day, like he'd done something heroic instead of just confirming what a server log showed. He deflected the attention, uncomfortable with being celebrated for what felt like just basic honesty, and went home to Maya, who cared infinitely more about the art project she'd finished than about any criminal conviction. That night, after Maya was asleep, Claire called. She was crying, which shocked him because he'd never imagined Claire Monroe as someone who cried. Not sad crying, she clarified through tears that were equal parts relief and release. Happy crying. Cathartic crying. The kind that came when something you'd been carrying for months finally got set down. "It's over," she said. "It's actually over." How do you feel? Exhausted, vindicated, angry that it took this long and cost this much. Grateful that it ended the right way. She laughed wetly. Mostly just tired. I've been living in fight-or-flight mode for almost a year. Now that the threat's gone, I don't know what to do with myself. You could rest, take a vacation, do something that isn't work or crisis management. I'm leaving Meridian, Claire said abruptly. I gave my notice this morning, 2 months, and I'm done. What will you do? I don't know yet. Maybe consulting, maybe start my own firm, maybe take 6 months off and figure out who I am when I'm not defined by corporate achievement and crisis response. She paused. What about you? Are you staying? Ethan thought about the question, about the systems analyst position that was challenging and stable, about the financial security he'd built, about the fact that Meridian had promoted him and given him opportunities he might not find elsewhere. But he also thought about what Claire had said in the coffee shop, about building something sustainable, about the night classes and computer science degree he'd been researching. I'm staying for now, he said, but I'm enrolling in classes this fall, part-time program, going to take me 4 years to finish while working full-time. But at the end, I'll have a degree and options and a career instead of just a job. That's good, Ethan. That's really good. You deserve options. They talked for a few more minutes, making vague promises to stay in touch that both of them knew probably wouldn't survive the transition out of crisis into normal life. People bonded by shared trauma rarely maintained connection once the trauma ended. The experience that had linked them would become something they'd both rather forget, and staying in contact would mean constantly reliving it. But for now, in this moment, they could acknowledge what they'd been through together, what they'd risked, what they'd survived. 2 months later, Ethan attended Claire's going-away party at a downtown restaurant, a small gathering of the few colleagues who'd supported her through the trial. She looked lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted that she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. They talked briefly at the end of the night, just the two of them on the sidewalk while others called ride shares and said their goodbyes. Thank you, Claire said simply, for showing up that night in Chicago, for testifying when you didn't have to, for being the kind of person who still believes integrity matters. Thank you for asking, Ethan replied, for trusting me with something that important, for giving me the chance to be brave when I didn't know I could be. They hugged, brief and professional, but genuine, then went their separate ways into the night. Ethan caught the train home, thinking about choices and consequences and all the ways one decision could ripple forward into futures you couldn't predict. That summer, Ethan started his classes. 2 nights a week, computer science fundamentals and programming theory, sitting in classrooms with students 10 years younger who'd come straight from high school while he'd taken the long route through survival and single parenthood. It was hard, balancing work and school and Maya's needs, staying up late to finish assignments after she was asleep, surviving on less sleep than he'd thought possible. But it was also energizing in ways he hadn't expected, proving to himself that he was capable of more than just endurance, that he could build something instead of just maintaining what existed. Maya started 3rd grade that fall, riding her purple bike to school now that the training wheels were off. Her gap-toothed smile replaced by adult teeth that made her look older than Ethan was ready for. She was proud of her dad being in school, told her friends that her daddy was learning computers just like they were learning multiplication. Ethan tried to explain that it was more complicated than that, but gave up when he realized she understood the essential truth, that learning never stopped, that growing was a process that continued regardless of age, that doing hard things was how you became who you were meant to be. The sentencing hearing happened in October, crisp fall weather matching the finality of justice being served. Richard Halloway was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the judge noting the sophistication of the scheme and the betrayal of corporate trust. Ethan didn't attend. He'd testified, done his part, and had no need to watch the man who'd threatened his daughter get locked away. Patricia Morales called him afterward to thank him again for his testimony, told him the conviction wouldn't have been possible without his willingness to step forward. You changed the trajectory of this case, she said. Maybe changed the trajectory of your company. Definitely changed your own life. That takes courage most people don't have. Ethan thought about courage as he went through the fall semester, as he watched Maya master long division and make new friends and slowly become the person she was going to be. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, he'd learned. It was choosing to act despite fear, choosing principles over comfort, choosing the hard right over the easy wrong, even when the cost was unclear and the outcome uncertain. By the time winter arrived, life had settled into rhythms that felt almost normal. Work was challenging but manageable. School was hard but rewarding. Maya was thriving in ways that had nothing to do with corporate drama or criminal trials. They'd moved to a slightly bigger apartment in a slightly better neighborhood, not luxury, but better than before, with enough space that Maya had her own room and Ethan had a desk where he could study without sitting at the kitchen table. One evening in December, Ethan was working on a programming assignment when Maya wandered over, curious about the code scrolling across his screen. "What are you making, Daddy?" "It's a program that sorts data, takes information and organizes it in useful ways." "Like organizing my toys?" "Kind of like that, yeah." She watched for a moment, then asked the question that had been building for months, maybe longer. "Daddy, why did you have to go to court that time? The time you were worried about?" Ethan saved his work and turned to face her fully, this 8-year-old person who deserved honest answers even when they were complicated. "Because someone at my work did something wrong, and I knew about it. I had to tell people what I knew so the person could be held accountable." "But it made you scared." "It did. Because telling the truth sometimes makes powerful people angry, and I was worried about what that might mean for us, for our life together." "But you did it anyway." I did it anyway." "Because telling the truth is important even when it's scary." "Yes, Bug, exactly that." Maya nodded, processing this with the seriousness she brought to important concepts. "Mrs. Patterson says that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared. Mrs. Patterson is very wise." "Are you still scared?" Ethan thought about the question honestly. Was he still scared? Not of Richard Halloway. He was in prison and would be for years. Not of losing his job. He had skills and credentials now that made him more employable than he'd ever been. Not of financial catastrophe. He had savings and stability and a career trajectory that pointed upward. But he was scared of other things. Scared of failing his classes. Scared of not being enough for Maya as she grew older and her needs became more complex. Scared of all the ways parenthood meant constant vulnerability, constant exposure to the possibility of failing someone you loved more than yourself. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not about the court stuff anymore. That's over. We're safe." "Good." Maya hugged him quickly, then returned to her coloring book, satisfied with the answer, trusting that her father would continue to protect her the way he always had. Ethan watched her for a moment, this small person who was the reason for everything, the motivation behind every hard choice and difficult decision. Then he turned back to his assignment, to the code that needed debugging, to the future he was building one class and one line of code at a time. Spring brought graduation from his first year of the program, a small milestone that felt enormous when Ethan walked across the stage to receive his certificate of completion. Maya was in the audience with Mrs. Chen, both of them applauding like he'd won a Nobel Prize instead of just finishing 2 semesters of coursework. But their pride was real, and his accomplishment was real, and the trajectory of his life was different than it had been a year ago in ways that mattered. He ran into Claire one afternoon in early summer, completely by accident, at a downtown coffee shop where she was meeting a client and he was grabbing caffeine between work and class. They talked for 15 minutes, catching up on the year since the trial, sharing updates about their respective lives. She'd started her own consulting firm specializing in corporate ethics and financial compliance, helping companies build systems to prevent the kind of fraud Richard had perpetrated. Business was good. She was happy. More than that, she was doing work that felt meaningful instead of just lucrative. "And you?" she asked. "How's school?" "Hard, but good. 1 year down, 3 to go. But I'm keeping up, and Maya's proud of me, which makes the exhaustion worth it." "You're building something real, Ethan. Something that can't be taken away from you. That matters more than most people realize." They parted with genuine warmth, 2 people who'd been through something significant together and come out better for it, even if the path had been harder than either would have chosen. Ethan walked back to his car thinking about that phrase, building something real. That's what all of this had been, really. The testimony and the trial and the promotion and the classes. Building something real out of the wreckage of crisis, out of the choice to tell the truth when lying would have been easier. By the time fall arrived again and Ethan started his second year of classes, the events in Chicago felt like they'd happened to someone else, like a story he'd heard rather than lived through. The intensity had faded, the fear had dissipated, and what remained was just the quiet satisfaction of having survived something that could have destroyed him but hadn't, of having made the hard choice and discovered he was capable of more than he'd known. Maya was in fourth grade now, riding her bike without any assistance, reading books that were too advanced for her age, asking questions about the world that Ethan sometimes struggled to answer. She'd stopped asking about the court case, moved on to other interests and concerns, but occasionally she'd reference it in passing, incorporating it into her understanding of how the world worked. Her daddy had been scared but had done the right thing anyway, and that made him brave, and bravery was something worth aspiring to. One night in October, Ethan was finishing an assignment when Maya came into his room, unable to sleep, wanting to talk about something that was bothering her. A friend at school was being bullied, and Maya didn't know whether to tell a teacher or stay quiet and avoid getting involved. "What would you do, Daddy?" she asked, climbing onto his bed, her face serious in the lamplight. Ethan set aside his laptop and pulled her close, thinking about the question and all its implications, about how every answer he gave was teaching her something about courage and consequence and the complicated ethics of intervention. "I would tell the teacher," he said finally, "even if it might make things harder for you. Because sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing, and standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves is more important than staying comfortable. But what if the bully gets mad at me? Then you deal with that when it happens, but you don't let fear of consequences stop you from doing what's right. You taught me that, actually." "I taught you?" "You did. When you asked me what kind of man I wanted you to remember me as. That question helped me make the right choice, even when I was scared." Maya thought about this, processing the way children do when they're trying to fit new information into their understanding of how the world works. "So I should tell Mrs. Patterson about the bullying." "I think you should. And whatever happens after, we'll figure it out together." She nodded, satisfied with this answer, and went back to bed. Ethan returned to his assignment but couldn't concentrate, thinking instead about the circularity of it, how teaching his daughter about courage had required him to be courageous, how her faith in him had demanded that he live up to it, how parenthood was this constant process of becoming the person your child believed you already were. The years that followed were marked by slow, steady progress rather than dramatic crisis. Ethan continued his degree program, continued his work as a systems analyst, continued building the kind of stable life he'd once thought impossible. Maya grew older and more independent, her questions becoming more sophisticated, her understanding of the world expanding beyond the simple narratives of childhood. They talked about the trial sometimes, about courage and consequences, and all the ways doing the right thing was complicated but necessary. By the time Ethan walked across the stage to receive his bachelor's degree in computer science, Maya was 11 years old, on the edge of adolescence, already showing signs of the person she was becoming, thoughtful, principled, unafraid to speak up when something felt wrong. She was in the audience with Mrs. Chen again, both of them cheering as he accepted his diploma, 4 years of night classes and exhaustion and determination finally culminating in this moment of completion. Afterward, in the parking lot, Maya hugged him with fierce pride. "I knew you could do it, Daddy. You're the most determined person I know." "I learned it from you, Bug, from watching you refuse to give up on anything you care about." "We learned it from each other," she said, wise beyond her years, understanding already that growth was mutual and that the best relationships were the ones that made both people better. Ethan drove them home through the evening light, thinking about the journey from that hotel room in Chicago to this moment in the parking lot, about all the choices and consequences and complicated truths that had brought him here. The promotion had become a career, the trial had become history, the fear had become a story about courage that he could tell his daughter when she needed reminding that bravery was possible. And Claire Monroe, wherever she was, had moved on to her own future, building her own version of meaningful work, living her own story of redemption and renewal. They'd saved each other in some fundamental way, her trust giving him purpose, his testimony giving her vindication, both of them proving that sometimes the right choice led somewhere good, even when the path was harder than anyone should have to walk. That night, after Maya was asleep, Ethan sat on his small balcony looking out at the city, thinking about power and truth and all the ways the world was both more just and more unjust than any simple narrative could capture. Richard Holloway was in prison but would eventually get out. Claire Monroe had built something meaningful but had lost years of her life to crisis and fear. Ethan had a degree and a career, but had also aged in ways that went beyond years, learned things about himself and the world that he wished he could unlearn. But Maya was asleep in her room, safe and loved and growing into someone remarkable. And that, Ethan thought, was what mattered most. Not whether courage always paid off, or whether justice always prevailed, or whether doing the right thing guaranteed positive outcomes. But whether, when it mattered, when the choice presented itself, you could look at yourself and your daughter and choose integrity over comfort, truth over convenience, bravery over fear. He'd made that choice once in a hotel room in Chicago, had testified at a board meeting and a criminal trial, had risked everything for a principle most people would have abandoned, and somehow, improbably, impossibly, it had worked out. Not perfectly, not without cost, but well enough that he could sit here on this balcony, degree completed, career established, daughter thriving, and feel like the man he wanted to be was the man he actually was. The city hummed below him, full of people making their own choices, living their own stories, navigating their own complicated relationships with courage and consequence. Somewhere out there, someone was probably facing the same decision Ethan had faced, whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to risk everything or protect what they had, whether integrity was worth its cost. And Ethan hoped, with the fierce certainty that came from having walked that path himself, that they would choose courage, would choose to be brave even when they were terrified, would discover, like he had, that doing the right thing didn't make you powerful, but proved you already were. Because in the end, that was the lesson. Not that the world was fair or that justice always prevailed or that courage guaranteed happy endings, but that the choice to act with integrity, even when the cost was high and the outcome uncertain, was the choice that let you live with yourself. The choice that taught your children what mattered. The choice that made you, in the quiet moments when no one was watching, the kind of person worth being. Ethan finished his coffee and went inside, checked on Maya one last time, and went to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to be brave or to be comfortable. But tonight, he could rest in the knowledge that when it had mattered most, he'd chosen well. And that was enough.